Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and this is obviously the first episode I'm doing in the absence of my beloved partner, Catherine Brobeck, who, as you all probably know, passed away at the end of last year. That is a very, very sad segue to saying Happy New Year, but I will say it nonetheless. Happy New Year to everyone. Welcome to 2022. It's already a wild ride in both good and bad ways. Good for me anyway, in that I am now the proud father of a newborn who is doing great. My sleep schedule may not be doing so great, but all is good on that front. Just to let you know the plan here, I absolutely will be finishing the project Catherine and I started together. When it comes to the short stories, we only had a handful of them left. So I'm going to be tackling those on my own, since Catherine and I never ranked the short stories. But for the novels we haven't done yet, I'll be inviting on a different friend of the podcast for each novel to discuss the rankings with me, because I don't think it really makes all that much sense for me to do the rankings alone. It requires a conversation. And I know how touched Catherine would be that our friends are stepping in to support us when we need them. So first up on this very episode is our longtime friend, Sophie Hannah. She of the best-selling psychological thrillers, and of course, she of the Christie Estate-approved Poirot continuation novels. We've spoken with her many a time before. Sophie will be joining me later in this episode for a discussion of the rankings of Passenger to Frankfurt, which is the novel that we will be discussing in this episode. But before that, I'm going to be breaking down the novel the same way Catherine and I have always done. But before that, even, I would like to do a little bit of housekeeping. I always like to give credit to our listeners when they contact us with worthwhile corrections or their own compelling tidbits of knowledge that I can display beside my own tidbits of knowledge. And in our By the Pricking of My Thumbs episode, we expressed some confusion about the nicknaming of the character Miss Bly as Nellie Bly. I believe I said something along the lines of the following: why exactly is Miss Bly, whose first name is not Nellie, called Nellie Bly? Is it because the journalist Nellie Bly pretended to be crazy when she did her 10-day stint inside an institution, resulting in her famous expose? Is it just because Nellie Bly was an efficient/hardworking person? I'm very confused. And Catherine and I remained confused on the episode, but fortunately, one of you wrote in afterward to explain what Christie was referencing here. And the answer is quite fascinating. So I'm just going to quote from that email in full. Please fast forward, by the way, if you haven't yet read By the Pricking of My Thumbs, because this gets a little spoilery. You asked if anyone knew anything about Nellie Bly and why the book's character may have been named Nellie Bly. In her investigations into mental asylums, including her infamous undercover work at one, she also worked with infamous killers who were mentally disturbed, as was the phrase at the time. The most notorious of these was Lizzie Halliday, a serial killer and arsonist who murdered at least one child. Halliday went around from mental institution to institution, much like how Mrs. Lancaster went from home to home. Halliday also buried a man under the floorboards of a house, a possible reference to the child in the fireplace. She also poisoned people in their tea, like the poisoned hot cocoa, and murdered a nurse at one of her institutions. She also frequently changed names. Although Halliday was far younger than Mrs. Lancaster, there are many similarities. Nellie Bly's relationship to Halliday is similar to the fictional Bly's to Mrs. Lancaster. In addition, the phrase "to pull a Nellie Bly" is an outdated expression meaning to tell a lie, which fits with Christie's Bly. It absolutely does. There you go. That is a remarkably intelligible explanation for what Christie was doing, and I am glad to have it, which is why I wanted to share it with you. You may also remember how during our Halloween party episode, we mused about how odd the working title Easeful Death was and how it basically made no sense. And one of you wrote in to school us on this, and you know how much I love to be schooled. So I'm going to quote directly from this email as well. And you should also fast forward if you haven't yet read Halloween Party. Here goes. I'm emailing about Easeful Death, which you may know is a reference to a line in Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. I have been half in love with Easeful Death. I think the original title of Halloween Party is supposed to refer to Michael Garfield persuading Miranda to sacrifice herself, that it's the best way forward / the only way out and sort of noble / spiritual. And I actually mentioned this email on our interview episode with John Copenhaver, the author of The Savage Kind, because that phrase, easeful death, came up in his novel as well. But our listener is so right. Christie was obviously quoting Keats. Poirot quotes Wordsworth from time to time, so we know that she loves her romantic poets. And what I love about this working title is that it's almost a clue in that it's directing the reader to focus on Miranda rather than Joyce, since there was nothing easeful about Joyce's death. So it's really brilliant. I always want to give Christie credit where she deserves it, and she absolutely does with that working title. Now I kind of wish Halloween Party had been called Easeful Death. I think it's a brilliant alternate title. So there you go. A little bit of housekeeping on some previous episodes. Let's move right along into discussing the book at hand, which is Passenger to Frankfurt. Speaking of alternate titles, we actually have two working titles that we know Christie used while she was writing this one. One was Passengers in Transit, and the other was Missing Passenger Story. Neither are all that exciting, so let's move along. It is worth noting, by the way, that Christie consistently spelt Frankfurt with an O in the second syllable in her notes. Shout out to Frankfurt, Kentucky, which is the capital of Kentucky and which city is spelled with an O. If there are any of you listening from Kentucky, I'd actually love to hear from you. I don't think we've ever heard from any Kentucky listeners thus far. But while we're on the topic of the title, we should also note that when Passenger to Frankfurt was originally published, there was actually a subtitle, which was an extravaganza. So that the full title read, Passenger to Frankfurt, an extravaganza. And as far as I can tell, the extravaganza part has been cut from subsequent editions. It's certainly not in mine. I'd actually be interested to hear if it is in any of yours, especially in the United Kingdom. I'm not sure if maybe that's something that's more standard across the pond, but that subtitle does not appear in my modern US edition. And we'll get into the extravaganza of it all in just a moment. But first, let's talk a little bit of publication history. The book was first published in the UK by, of course, Collins Crime Club in September 1970, and in the United States by, of course, Dodd Mead later in the same year. Incidentally, the International Standard Book Number, aka ISBN system, was introduced in 1970. So this is the first Agatha Christie novel to have an ISBN on the first edition. But the really interesting thing about the publication date is not necessarily the year. We know that this is a late career Christie, but the time of year, because usually Christies were published in November or December, A Christie for Christmas, right? Even Halloween Party, I railed against the fact that there was no Halloween tie-in. It was published in November. But this book we have published earlier in September, and it was actually published specifically on the 15th of September, which was, of course, Agatha Christie's birthday. And we know per John Curran that this book was published on her 80th birthday and claimed to be Agatha Christie's 80th book. So to get to 80, Christie's publishers had to do some creative counting, just as they did with A Murder is Announced, which they claimed was her 50th book, published in 1950. It wasn't really. And this isn't really her 80th book. It's her 61st mystery novel. We have 5 more after this one. And the other 19 books that they were counting are short story collections and even the Mary Westmacotts. Again, I'm quoting Curran here, only by counting the American collections, all of which contain stories not then published in Britain, as well as the Mary Westmacott titles, could this all-important figure be arrived at. And then this, I think, is a really great tidbit. Christie was notoriously unwilling to do much publicity, but even she had to acknowledge that something would have to be done for this book since it was being published as a birthday book. And per Christie biographer Janet Morgan, I'm quoting from her now, she escaped with only an effusive interview in the Daily Mail by Godfrey Wynne, who, to everyone's delight, was bitten by Bingo. Bingo would be Christie's latest dog. She had many. I'm quoting again from Morgan. Bingo was irredeemably neurotic. It turned out that he had been so terrified as a puppy that he bit almost everyone in sight. Only Agatha was immune. So I love that Agatha's loyal pup bit the journo. This was probably the only interview she ever enjoyed. Love that for her. Moving right along, let's talk about the dedication, which I don't always want to highlight, but I think it's important for Passenger to Frankfurt. It reads, leadership, besides being a great creative force, can be diabolical. ... And this really does set the tone for the book, that tone being paranoid. We'll talk more about that. But I also wanted to point out that this quote is attributed to Jan Smuts, who's a really interesting person to quote in a book obsessed with international relations. Jan Smuts is a South African statesman who In addition to having some very stuck in their time opinions about race, was instrumental in the formation of the League of Nations in 1920. But he also played a role in the formation of the United Nations a quarter century later. And here's another fun fact for you. He's actually the only person to have signed the charters of both the League of Nations and the United Nations. I find it really fascinating that in a book that could be read as a cautionary tale against the dissolution of traditional national identities, the dangers of too much transnational mixing and fomenting, if you will. Christie chose to quote a man who pretty much hung his career on international cooperation. I'll have a little bit more to say about this later, in particular, what was happening with the European Economic Community while Christie was writing this book. And I think that's fascinating too. So more to come on that front. Now let's talk about the introduction, because in addition to the dedication, we also have an introduction, and we do get these sometimes. Occasionally, these books have little introductions, but not too often. And I think this one, like the dedication, is significant, certainly significant enough to mention. So it's one of these cozy fireside chat-like addresses. I will use the word cozy to describe the introduction, and the introduction only. Christie talks directly to the reader. She kind of treads a lot of the same territory that she already did by way of Mrs. Oliver and Halloween Party and previous novels, talking about how she never takes characters from real life because they have to be hers for them to work in her stories. But she also talks about how she comes up with her ideas and how she uses real life settings to inspire her. And she references Death on the Nile, The Pale Horse, Murder on the Orient Express, Why Didn't They Ask Evans? I believe she also makes more glancing references to At Bertram's Hotel, A Caribbean Mystery, Three-Act Tragedy, and Cat Among the Pigeons, if you're paying attention. And I know some of you are, many of you are. But beyond observing her settings with her own eyes and ears, she also admits to turning to the newspaper, which is something we know she did for Halloween Party. We talked about that in our previous episode. And she was horrified by what she read every day as she was reading the newspaper in this period. And she reiterates that horror now, writing, "Look at that front page every day for a month, make notes, consider, and classify. Every day there is a killing, a girl strangled, elderly woman attacked and robbed of her meager savings, young men or boys attacking or attacked, buildings and telephone kiosks smashed and gutted, drug smuggling, robbery and assault, children missing and children's murdered bodies found not far from their homes. Can this be England? Is England really like this? One feels, no, not yet, but it could be." And later, actually, once we get into the story proper, she has her protagonist, Sir Stafford Nye, think to himself as he's reading the morning paper, "No child had been kidnapped or raped this morning. That was a nice surprise." When I read that, I just wrote, wow, in the margin. You can really feel her contempt, I think, both in this introduction and in the story proper for modern society. She's really horrified by what she sees people being up to. And all this horror and consternation is really her point. It's the raison d'etre, if you will. And I will continue to employ my bad French accent whenever possible in Catherine's honor. It is the raison d'etre of this introduction, because I think that what Christie is doing in this book is something similar to what all those casual fans of Christie actually accuse her of doing all the time. She's setting her story in a fantasy land, right? The thing is, it's not a timeless fantasy land. There is nothing ideal or idealized about it. On the contrary, it's a fantasy land rooted in the specific fear and paranoia that Christie and presumably others around her were feeling in 1970 as a result of all the social and political tumults that was surrounding them. And Christie continues in this introduction, "To write a story in this year of our Lord, 1970, you must come to terms with your background. If the background is fantastic, then that story must accept its background. It, too, must be a fantasy, an extravaganza. The setting must include the fantastic facts of daily life. This story is, in essence, a fantasy. It pretends to be nothing more, but most of the things that happen in it are happening or giving promise of happening in the world of today. It is not an impossible story. It is only a fantastic one." And that's how she ends the introduction. And this actually made me think of our friend Sophie Hannah's rule, which she brought up on an earlier episode about how in a mystery, in the mysteries that she writes and mysteries that she loves and reads, a plot contrivance merely has to be possible, not probable. And the fantastic can be made to work in a mystery because fantastic things are not impossible things. They're just unusual. And whether or not Christie does make that work in this book remains to be seen. I think there are arguments to be made in either direction. But on that note, let's just jump right into the book itself. I can't believe we've had this long of a preamble. Catherine would be rolling her eyes at me audibly by this point, but we will start off, of course, in our breakdown with the victim. And as you probably know, Passenger to Frankfurt is not a puzzle mystery. It is very much a thriller. It is, in fact, the last Christie thriller, unless you count Postern of Fate. But I think we can safely say that Postern of Fate is neither a whodunit nor a thriller, nor much of anything else. Boy, will we get to that in a bit. Regardless, I'm going to try to do our usual breakdown for consistency's sake. And for that reason, I will say that our victim, who is not murdered, is our hero and protagonist, Sir Stafford Nye, a 45-year-old British diplomat whose wry sense of humor has done serious damage to his career. But perhaps all that is about to change for Staffy when he allows a strange woman, a mystery lady, to take his passport and drug him at the Frankfurt airport so that she can go to London pretending to be him. I mentioned in our previous episode that I'd been to the Frankfurt airport thrice, and I have never had as exciting a time at that airport, let me tell you. Moving on to our suspects, this too is a tricky category in a thriller like Passenger to Frankfurt, but we do eventually, about 2/3 of the way through the book, learn that there is a sinister villain working behind the scenes who goes by an alias. Not so much a criminal mastermind as a super spy with a crucial role to play in the overarching criminal conspiracy that is afoot. So in that, the unmasking of this mysterious person is the central mystery to be solved. And we've seen that time and time again in previous Christie thrillers. Our suspects are any of the characters who might be this person. And unusually for a Christie novel, we are told outright that this person is female. And that makes me happy because it means I do not have to list the many male talking heads who populate this book in various conference rooms, chattering away about international politics. I will mention some, but not even all of them as I'm going through my plot summary, because they're really not that important and they are certainly not a strong point of this book. But this mysterious woman, her alias is Jay or Juanita. And here are the few people who she can be. So here are our suspects. First up is the mystery lady, of course, who Staffy meets at the Frankfurt airport. And she goes by 3 different names over the course of the book. First, there's Daphne Theodophanus, which was the name she was traveling under for her flight out of Frankfurt. The second is Marianne, which is clearly an alias. It's kind of her spy code name. The third is what we eventually learn is her true name, and it's what I'll be calling her for the rest of the episode, the Countess Renata Zerkowski. And as the mystery lady who starts everything off and who will become Staffy's partner in intrigue, she really, I think, is our main suspect. You know, is she on the side of good, or is she secretly Juanita pulling strings from deep within a web of her own making? We shall see. Next up, we have Mildred, aka Millie Jean Cortman, a pocket Venus, which is an old-fashioned term for a small, attractive woman. And she is the socialite wife to Sam Cortman, who is called the American ambassador. And I'm assuming that means he's the American who's been appointed by the US president as ambassador to the United Kingdom. His name definitely sounds fairly American. She showed a lot of restraint, actually, I think, in naming an American ambassador just Sam Cortman and not something much more outrageous. So brava, Christie. But Millie Jean is smart and well-connected and very much within the world that Sir Stafford inhabits. Then next we have a Lady Matilda Cleckheaton, aka Aunt Matilda. She's the daughter of an earl on her father's side and the daughter of an actress on her mother's side. She is Staffy's very fun and very chatty aunt, and secretly, or maybe not so secretly, the best character in the book, except maybe for Stafford himself, actually. The scenes between Stafford and Aunt Matilda, I think, are by far the best in the book. And like Miss Marple, Aunt Matilda seems fluffy and harmless, but as it turns out, she's actually extremely knowledgeable, both about international criminal conspiracies and would-be scientific breakthroughs that just may save the human race. So we should definitely keep an eye on her. Do I smell a dark Marple in the making? Perhaps. And then finally, we have Amy Leatherin, who I couldn't resist including here since it means I get to point out that this is not the same Amy Leatherin who narrated Murder in Mesopotamia. At least I don't think it is, since the character Amy Leatherin in this book is young, and Nurse Amy Leatherin appeared in Murder in Mesopotamia over 30 years earlier. But please do message me if you have some theories on how this could be the same person, or maybe a relation or something like that. I love a good underlying conspiracy theory as to character continuity in the Christieverse. In any case, Amy Leatherin is Aunt Matilda's paid companion, and she seems nice. But is she nice, or is she Juanita? All right, let's get into the world as it appears to be, in which we open, as we almost uniformly do in a Christie novel, even one as late as Passenger to Frankfurt, with a killer hook. And I already mentioned this hook. Sir Stafford Nye's plane to Geneva has been rerouted to Frankfurt owing to fog. That made me think incidentally of Christie's original play, The Unexpected Guest, where fog plays such an important role. And if you'd like to hear me and Catherine have an extended conversation about fog as a general proposition, please do check out our Patreon episode on The Unexpected Guest. Also, it makes sense that the plane was rerouted to Frankfurt, since even though Frankfurt isn't a city many people think of as much of a cultural center of Europe or even Germany, it is very much a hub of international travel, which is why it makes sense that the Frankfurt Book Fair is held there. That is the event that I have attended 3 times, which is why I have been a passenger to Frankfurt in the past. I would say that Frankfurt is kind of the Chicago of Europe in that way. How's that for an American-centric analogy for you? So Sir Stafford was supposed to fly into Geneva and then from there to London, but now he's just going to fly from Frankfurt to London, or Prestwick if he must. And he's just kind of sitting around bored. You know, we've all been there in an airport, though perhaps, you know, we were playing, say, Best Fiends, shout out to Howie the Lizard, rather than quoting Sir Walter Raleigh, which is what Sir Stafford does. I wish I loved the human race. I wish I loved its silly face. Although he doesn't misattribute the quote to Chesterton. I don't really know what Chesterton he was referring to there. I'm just going to go ahead and assume it's G.K. Chesterton. Anywho, a woman approaches him. She isn't conventionally pretty, but he likes that because he's not basic when it comes to his preferences for the ladies. This woman has, quote, a delicate high-bridged aquiline nose, a black heavy bush of hair, and she looks familiar to him, but he can't place it. And she says that she was supposed to go to Geneva, but now, of course, that's impossible due to the fog. And if she goes anywhere else as herself, she'll be killed. So I suppose this means, by the way, that the two of them were on the same flight that got them to Frankfurt, though this isn't spelled out. I should mention, by the way, that Staffy is wearing a rather flashy bandit's cloak he bought in Corsica, which is, quote, very dark purpley blue in color with a scarlet lining and a kind of burnous hanging down behind. And I had to look up what a burnous is. And apparently it's a one-piece hooded cloak worn by Arabs and Berbers. I think the key is that it's one piece of material, which to my mind makes it look pretty similar to a poncho, though unlike a poncho, there's an actual hood that drapes down the back, adding a bit of flair. And that's very much why Staffy wears it. As Christie writes, there was something about him of the 18th century buck. He liked to be noticed. And, you know, I do have to say, for a book that I am going to criticize a lot, Sir Stafford really does immediately jump off the page as a fully fleshed character. He's a great character. And I think it's also worth mentioning, this is something that I got from John Curran, that Sir Stafford actually has a precursor in the doomed Sir Rupert Crofton Lee from They Came to Baghdad. And don't worry, that's not really a spoiler. He dies right at the beginning of that novel. But both characters have an international reputation. They make their appearance in airports, and they both, quote, favor the dramatic look by wearing long cloaks with hoods. So I think that's interesting because there is a little bit of shared DNA, honestly, between They Came to Baghdad and Passenger to Frankfurt. And even, I might add, Destination Unknown. There are all these roving international thrillers of Christie's in her mid to late career. And they have a bit of a similar flavor to them in both good and bad ways. And if I'm being honest, more bad than good. So this as yet nameless mystery lady asks Staffy to borrow his cloak and passport because she actually sort of resembles him. And as he gets a better look at her, he realizes the reason he thought he'd seen her before is that she looks like his sister Pamela, who died years ago. And apparently Pamela and Stafford looked very much alike, which means actually it's himself that he sees in this woman. And boy, there's a lot to unpack there on a psychosexual level, but let's move swiftly along. Staffy agrees to this crazy scheme because that's just the sort of daring and unconventional fellow he is. And he leaves his cloak for her and sort of wanders away and loiters in and around I imagine it being the kind of gift shop or convenience store area, like the Hudson News of the Frankfurt airport in 1970, if you will. He's, of course, giving the mystery lady a chance to take the cloak and the passport. He buys a book along with a stuffed panda for his niece, and then he sits back down in his seat where he has left his beer unattended. And this is where he really goes the extra mile, because he has agreed to let this woman drug the beer he's drinking so that he will fall asleep. And oopsie, misses flight while this woman gets on as him. And that's precisely what happens. Fortunately, the mystery lady was not a serial killer. Staffy does not die. And while he is snoozing, someone gets on the intercom at the airport and asks, will Miss Daphne Theodophanis, passenger to Geneva, kindly come to the flight desk? Plane to Geneva is delayed owing to fog. Passengers will travel by way of Athens. The aeroplane is now ready to leave. But alas, Daphne is going to miss her flight. And the chapter closes with this funny monologue spoken by the mother of a young child who we'll never see again. And you can just tell that this is coming straight from Christie's mouth. And she says, I've always wondered, about a passenger that's missing. Nearly always, whenever you go anywhere by air, you hear it. Somebody they can't find, somebody who hasn't heard the call or isn't on the plane or something like that. I always wonder who it is and what they're doing and why they haven't come. I suppose that Miss What's-a-Name, or whatever it is, will just have missed her plane. What will they do with her then? And I feel like this is probably the genesis of the book, or, one of the germs from which it started. I can just see Christie sitting in a passenger terminal, perhaps the transit passenger lounge at Frankfurt, and hearing one of those announcements and thinking to herself, And, true story, but I was once at the airport, not Frankfurt, but LAX here in Los Angeles. And this same sort of announcement played over the intercom. And for once, I actually knew the people who were named. It was a couple. I'm not going to name them here, but they were totally the types to be running late for a flight. They were kind of a mess, and it made sense. And I sort of chuckled to myself. It was really unusual, though, to recognize the names of those people called, because I agree. You usually just have this sense of anonymous names being called and thinking, like, what is going on with that person? Like, what's the deal? So anyway, it's just a great opening scene. Christie really just never lost her knack for hooking her readers at the beginning of her books. Staffy wakes up eventually. He has to get on a later flight without his passport, which makes for some embarrassment when he returns home and his diplomatic colleagues, Chetwynd, Horsam, Monroe, Eric Pugh, Colonel Pikeaway, Sir George Packham. You don't really need to remember these names because they aren't important. I'm not even listing all of the names. They're all like, so you lost your passport and passed out in an airport lounge? Are you okay? Do we need to stage an intervention? But he doesn't tell them about the mystery lady, and he just laughs them off, which is exactly what Sir Stafford always does and continues to do, even after he realizes someone's entered his flat under false pretenses and rifled through his things. But of course, he is desperate to find out who the mystery lady was. Is she okay? Was she really going to die if he hadn't helped her? So he does what Christie herself did during her infamous disappearance. He takes out an ad in the paper. And the ad reads, passenger to Frankfurt, November 3rd. Please communicate with fellow traveler to London. He figures if she's willing to reach out, that will be enough. And of course, we get our title check there, which is very pleasing. And eventually he does get a reply. And the reply reads, passenger from Frankfurt, Thursday, November 11th, Hungerford Bridge, 7:20. So he goes to Hungerford Bridge near Charing Cross on November 11th at 7:20 p.m., where a woman in a Macintosh collides with him, slipping in both senses of the word, slipping to her knees, and then also slipping a ticket in his hand as Staffy helps her up, gentleman that he is. She, of course, then disappears, leaving behind this ticket for the next evening's show at the Festival Hall. So go to the show, Staffy does, and the show features a wide selection of Wagner, in particular, Der Ring des Nibelungen, aka The Ring Cycle. Which, as you may know, consists of 4 operas, Das Rheingold, Die Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. I believe I've spoken about this before, probably in our All About Opera episode, one of my favorite early episodes that we did. But I watched The Ring Cycle a number of years ago here in Los Angeles. God, I think it's at least 10 years ago at this point. And it really was quite an undertaking for me, let alone the singers. But it was an undertaking as an audience member because it's 4 operas. They're many, many hours long. And Sir Stafford apparently prefers the first and the last, Das Rheingold and Götterdämmerung. And I actually totally agree with him. And I wonder if that was Christie's opinion as well. It's perhaps not a coincidence that Das Rheingold is by far the shortest, although it still clocks in at well over 2 hours. The rest of them are more like 3 to 4 hours in length. In any case, he's listening to a whole mess of Wagner. And for the first half, it looks like poor Staffy has been ghosted because the seat next to him is empty. But as he returns for the intermission, he sees that the mystery lady has arrived. And he sits down, he tries to play it all cool. He's like not really looking at her. At one point, she asks for his program, and he can see that she's writing something in it. So she gives that back to him. And then at one point during the performance, she says with a little sigh in her voice, "The young Siegfried." And then, much to his disappointment, when everyone gets up to go, she just skedaddles, clearly not interested in having him follow her. So, as you can imagine, he scours that program, which he knows she wrote in, but much to his disappointment, all he finds written in it is the notes to a musical motif. And that motif, unsurprisingly, is the motif of the young Siegfried. That is to say, it's the musical phrase that appears every time that Siegfried appears on the stage. And fortunately for you, I can play that motif now, even though Christie could not in her novel, since this is a podcast and we are in an oral with an AU medium, after all. So here's that motif. Okay, so that happens. And from there, Staffy decides to visit his Aunt Matilda pretty much just because. It's like he's been meaning to visit her. He likes her. So he just goes to her room. She lives in like one section of a very grand old estate. And while he's there, he muses with her in several delightful and extended sequences about all sorts of topics, dead family relatives, whether it's a good idea just to bring people together who want to fight each other into a bunch of football fields and let them duke it out, thereby avoiding war. This is Aunt Matilda's crazy idea. What Aunt Matilda used to do with her downtime. She could only read novels in the afternoon, not the morning, a distinction I find endlessly amusing. Oh, and, the worldwide political unrest that's underpinning a wide-ranging international criminal conspiracy. Just some light banter. But seriously, no one is more surprised than Staffy when his Aunt Matilda busts out with the very phrase the mystery lady said, the young Siegfried. And Aunt Matilda is very coy. She clearly knows more than she's letting on. So Staffy leaves pretty much as much in the dark as he was before, except that now he and we know that there's some sort of political conspiracy at play that's exploiting the destructive tendencies of the youths in much the same way Hitler exploited the young with his Hitler Youth program. And yes, Aunt Matilda explicitly references the Hitler Youth. There are a lot of references to Hitler in this book. From there, Staffy attends a dinner at the American Embassy hosted by Millie Jean Corbin, the Pocket Venus. And at this dinner, lo and behold, he meets the Countess Renata Zerkowski, aka the Mystery Lady. And Renata essentially abducts Staffy from this dinner. He jokes that it's a hijacking. Hijacking's being so very in at the moment. And she takes him to an unassuming looking house. He throws shade at the house by calling it a stockbroker tutor, which is also a phrase I had to look up, even though it's pretty self-explanatory. It means the sort of house that's been done up to seem old, even though it's brand spanking new. So nouveau riche, in other words. And in this tacky house, Staffy and Renata have a big old meeting with 4 other people. Mr. Robinson, who we have met before, he of the yellow face and the financial expertise. Lord Altamount, an elder statesman who apparently stands for England and knows the value of every politician and government official in England pretty well, even if he's never spoken to them. Cool. Altamount's dog's body of sorts, the restless and fidgety Sir James Cleek. And finally, one of those security operatives who just sort of lurk in the background in this book and who we met briefly already a few pages earlier, Henry Horsam. So together with Renata, this group have gathered to propose that Staffy join their ranks in defeating the enemy. Whoever that enemy is, doing whatever that enemy is doing to foment unrest and destruction and chaos all over the world via student protests that lead to revolutions and whatnot, I guess. To be honest, I wish I could get more specific here about the nature of this enemy. I really cannot. I suspect that is something Sophie and I will be talking a lot about when we rank this book, because it's a big problem. But apparently Staffy is a perfect candidate to help in this cause, precisely because he doesn't take things too seriously and he has no interest in pleasing people. And they need him to train his skeptical eye on matters. So after a lot of talking, he agrees. Paris. And from there, he embarks on a series of globe-trotting engagements with Renata that involve a lot of dressing up and attending concerts and fancy dinners and whatnot, but which we actually see very little of, unfortunately. I was honestly surprised how glancing Christie's treatment of this sequence was, because I think it could have been way more fun. But by far, the most important stop on this globe-trotting tour of Staffy and Renata's is the one they make at a charming little Schloss. That would be the German word for castle or manor house, where they meet the Gräfin Charlotte von Walshausen, née Charlotte Crapp. No, really, that is her name, aka Big Charlotte. And Charlotte is a fantastic villain. And I'm sure Sophie and I will be talking a lot about her, giving Christie points on character for her, because she really does deserve them where Big Charlotte is concerned. Basically, Charlotte is one of the focal points of this international criminal conspiracy. She's pulling a lot of the strings here. And Renata presents Stafford as though he were someone who could help the conspiracy proliferate in England. And it's while we're at the Schloss that we get a glimpse of the young Siegfried himself. And this is a man who is big and muscular and attractive and blonde-haired. He goes by the name Franz Joseph, but he's rumored to be the actual son of Adolf Hitler and the figurehead of this movement that is exploiting the youth of the world. And again, it's worth noting that even though there is a lot of chatter as to this supposed conspiracy, chatter on the part of English diplomats, chatter on the part of French government officials, chatter on the part of German doctors, and many, many others, it really never gets more specific than this weirdo diagram that we get 2/3 of the way through the book. The diagram is called the Ring, and it consists of 5 overlapping circles that represent this criminal conspiracy. And I suppose the ring is meant to be redolent of Wagner's Ring Cycle, what with the young Siegfried imagery, whatever. So it looks a little like a flower petal with 1 circle in the middle and then 4 circles surrounding it, each of those circles overlapping with the circle in the center, but not with each other. And the circle in the middle is labeled F for finance. And this is the center of things controlled by Big Charlotte. And then the villainous petals are as follows: A for armaments, weaponry, of course; D for drugs. Pushers of drugs will be followed up, Mr. Robinson promises. Ms. Norbury better watch out.
She was so queer. She was like, "I'm a pusher, Katie. I'm a pusher."
What does that even mean?
Like a drug pusher? Probably. She said she works 3 jobs.
S for science. That would be chemical and biological warfare. And finally, J for Juanita, which is the code name of a woman, quote, said to be dangerous, no knowledge of her real name. So I would just like to repeat that we don't get this information till 2/3 of the way through the book. And even when we do, it's just really not all that helpful. So anyway, the day after Staffy and Renata arrive at the Schloss, Staffy is actually able to hear this Franz Joseph speak, and he is extremely impressed. Though we don't hear anything Franz Joseph says, we're just supposed to take Christie's word for it that he's an amazing speaker. Now, you may be asking yourself, how exactly could Hitler have a son? Well, eventually we do get that backstory, which is essentially a conspiracy theory that one day while the Second World War was still raging, Adolf Hitler visited an asylum filled with crazy people who thought they were Hitler. And he pulled off a switcheroo whereby a fake Hitler went back to his bunker. And that's where Hitler's body was, of course, found, while the real Hitler was smuggled out of the asylum and relocated to, oh yes, Argentina, of all places. I wonder if he caught sight of Captain Hastings while he was out there, where supposedly he had a baby with, quote, a beautiful Aryan girl of good family, the child being branded in the foot with the mark of the swastika. This child was then brought up, prepared as the Dalai Lama might have been prepared for his great destiny. And that child, of course, is Franz Joseph. So that's kind of where we are as we wrap up the world as it appears to be. And this grand criminal master plan seems to be working. You know, we learned that Argentina and Brazil and Cuba have gotten together. They've combined into one super country and called themselves the Golden Youth Federated States. There's an army that's keeping them in power. So there seems to be some sort of martial law in place. And let's just take a moment to acknowledge how bizarre this is in the world of Christie, that she is creating an alternate reality here, a warped dystopian version of the real world in which certain political events that very much have not happened in the real world are happening in hers. It's just not something that she does. And she called it out in the introduction. She said, this is an extravaganza. This is a fantasy, but a fantasy that she thinks could very well become a reality in the near future. It's just really interesting, even if it's not done perfectly. It's all going very, very badly. We learn that Sam Cortman, the American ambassador and husband to Millie Jean, has actually been shot to death, apparently by rioters. The baddies are winning, the goodies are fretting, and we basically have a more wide-ranging Hitler Youth situation on our hands here, with Hitler's actual son poised to be the leader of it all. So, let's move on over now into the world as it actually is. And unfortunately, I have no bridge for you, listeners. There are no clues in this book, since Passenger to Frankfurt is by no means a puzzle mystery. I don't think, though, that anyone will be surprised to learn that Franz Joseph, aka the young Siegfried, aka Adolf Hitler Jr., is, of course, not Hitler's son. He is, quote, a common or garden fraud, a rank imposter. He's the son of an Argentinian carpenter and a good-looking blonde, a small part German opera singer. And we learn that in his early youth, this man was, oh yes, a professional actor. He was also branded in the foot with a swastika, and then this story was made up for him full of romantic details. And the documents that Renata was traveling with when she got unexpectedly stuck in Frankfurt were as follows: affidavits, photostats, signed declaration, including one from the mother, and medical evidence as to the date of the scar, copy of the original birth certificate of Carl Aguileros, and signed evidence of his identity with the so-called Franz Joseph, the whole bag of tricks. So this, of course, bursts the bubble of the whole conspiracy, though I found myself wondering that if that were the case, why exactly was it necessary for Staffy to get involved and do all of this globetrotting once he helped Renata get away at the very beginning of the story? We're told that supposedly the good guys are waiting for the right moment for a spectacular debunking of a first-class imposter, but come on. A little hard to swallow, but never mind. Let's move things along here. We're almost done. And you might be wondering, how could we not be done? Because the conspiracy theory has been debunked. You know, the bad guys are going to be humiliated. The status quo will be preserved. Game over. But oh no, Christie is not done with us yet. Because late in this book, we learn that there is a scientist who we've never heard of before, named Robert Shoreham, who is friends with, you guessed it, Aunt Matilda, and who back in the day told Aunt Matilda about a project called Project Benvo. Now, what is Project Benvo, you might ask? Or you might not ask, because you might be done with this book at this point, and that is definitely how I was feeling, but we shall persevere. Apparently, Benvo was some sort of synthetic chemical substance that, when administered to people, would make them benevolent. Like, it would make them altruistic and nice to each other, which is maybe a good thing or maybe not. Apparently, it would permanently change the character of anyone who ingested it or inhaled it. I don't know what form it would even take, whether liquid or gas. To give Christie credit, she never really seems to come down on either side of this issue. But basically, this scientist who came up with it, everyone assumed he was dead, but he's not. What he did do was to destroy his work. So all of his Project Benvo work, he just torched. And then 3 weeks later, he had a stroke and he became paralyzed on one side. You know, he can't speak very well. He's holed himself up in the north of Scotland. So a bunch of the characters who we've met in this novel at this point go up to the north of Scotland. That would be Lord Altamount, his faithful attendant, Sir James Cleek, Henry Horsam, Colonel Monroe, and Mr. Robinson. Staffy and Renata are not present, actually, up in the north of Scotland, which I found rather odd considering they've been sort of the protagonists of the story this far, but whatever. I do have to say that the trip up north did remind me of the trip Inspector Craddock takes in A Murder is Announced to see Belle Gedler, since apparently Scotland is where Christie likes to go for info dumps. But we learn up in Scotland that the reason Dr. Shoreham destroyed his work wasn't because he couldn't figure out how to finish it or, you know, pull off what he started. He actually 100% pulled it off. What he was afraid of was what the science could do if used indiscriminately. But Mr. Robinson insists that he has to reconstitute Benvo, that it's exactly what the world needs. It will make people inclined not toward happiness in and of itself, but toward making others happy. And it's imperative that he get back to work. Dr. Shoreham indicates that if Lord Altamount wants him to do it, then he'll do it. And this is the point at which Sir James Cleek pulls out a hypodermic needle and tries to jab it into Lord Altamount's arm. But Henry Horsham gets there first and wrenches it away. So we learn that Sir James Cleek has been a mole this whole time, working for the bad guys. And then a nurse who's been waiting outside rushes in and she pulls a gun out of her uniform and tries to shoot Dr. Shoreham, but he's blocked. So Sir James Cleek yells out, "Get Altamount, Juanita, quick, get Altamount." And she does. She shoots him and Altamount dies, although it also seems like he was having a heart attack from the shock of it all. So I was honestly not sure whether he died from the gunshot or the heart attack. But in any case, Altamount is very much dead, but he was kind of on death's door already. And he's kind of served his purpose, I think, for the country and certainly the story. And the baddies have been identified and carted away. We do also learn that Millie Jean Juanita Cortman is actually the one who killed her husband, the American ambassador, who a couple characters theorized was getting wise to his wife's spy games. So she just pinned the murder on rioters. And I have to say, there's an argument to be made that I should have structured this whole summary differently and made Sam Cortman our victim, our sole clue as to who done it being that we should always look at the spouse, of course. But let's be real. Technically, this is a murder that gets solved at the end of the novel, but it is the most tangential of murder mysteries. So tangential, I would argue it's not a proper mystery at all. But on the bright side, Dr. Shoreham has been reinvigorated by this experience to the point where he can talk again all of a sudden, and he vows to bring Project Benvo to fruition once more, which is maybe a yay, maybe an uh-oh. Again, sort of up to you. Carl Aguileros, FKA, Franz Joseph, FKA, the young Siegfried, has a new gig as the organist at Aunt Matilda's church, because why not? And we end in Papa Poirot-ish fashion on, oh yes, Sir Stafford Nye and Countess Renata Zerkowski getting married. And do you remember that stuffed panda he bought for his niece when he was loitering in Frankfurt airport? Well, that stuffed panda is going to be his best man for the wedding because apparently he doesn't have any real friends. The end. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, well, before we get into our rankings, let's talk about the adaptations that exist for this novel. And psych, there aren't any adaptations. This is actually one of only 4 Christie novels not to be adapted in any way, the others being Death Comes as the End. Still, I thought that we were going to get our BBC adaptation of Death Comes as the End, but apparently it fell apart. Very sad. Destination Unknown was also not adapted, and Postern of Fate, which we, of course, have not gotten to. But interestingly, per Christie biographer Laura Thompson, Christie repeatedly turned down a request from Hollywood to film Passenger to Frankfurt, and our good friend Mark Aldrich gives us a bunch more background on this in Agatha Christie on Screen, and it's worth dwelling on for a moment because it's really amusing. So we know that Christie got all sorts of requests for adaptation, most of which she rejected because she was just not very into adaptations, particularly by this point in her career after the debacle of the MGM Marple movies. But as Mark tells it, One particularly insistent but consistently rebuffed request came from David Shine, a controversial character who had inherited great wealth as the son of a New York hotel magnate. Shine expressed keen interest in making a film of Christie's globetrotting thriller Passenger to Frankfurt, even going so far as to write to her at her home address in spring 1972, enclosing a list of Academy Awards won by The French Connection, of which he was one of 2 executive producers. And Mark further clarifies in an endnote at the end of this chapter that when he asked the director of The French Connection what influence Shine had on the film, the director's response via Twitter was simple: 0, none whatsoever. So this David Shine was just a total nuisance. And writing to Lord Mountbatten in 1972, Christie outlined letters she had received from him with frustration. I have been engaged in a battle for some time now with Mr. David Shine of New York, who has apparently a terrible yearning to make a film from my Passenger to Frankfurt. From what I have heard and seen of the extremely successful films he has apparently made, I have refused with the utmost firmness to meet him and discuss the matter, and my literary agent backs up this refusal about twice a month, as far as I can make out. I have pointed out that seeing films adapted from my books has given me so much agony that I now wish to have no more films of any kind made from my writings. And then Mark continues, for Christie readers, Shine's choice of story to adapt might seem curious, since Passenger to Frankfurt is generally regarded as one of the very weakest Christie novels, described as an incomprehensible muddle by Robert Barnard in his critical appreciation of Christie's works, a sentiment echoed by many readers. However, the rationale for the choice appears to lie in Shine's background rather than the literary merit of this particular adventure. One of the controversies in which he had been involved was his assistance of U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy in the anti-communist hearings of the 1950s, so we may infer that questions of international conspiracies, the relative merits of nationalism, and the threat of political extremism, all explored in Passenger to Frankfurt's tale of a secret Nazi cabal, were of particular personal interest. It seems possible that the intention was to make a piece designed to provoke public interest in apparent enemies of the United States, especially as, despite his credit on The French Connection, Shine would not go on to forge a career in the film industry, indicating that celluloid was not his artistic calling. Mark also notes that when Murder on the Orient Express started to come together in 1974, quote, the publicity surrounding the forthcoming film was starting to grow, and with it, disgruntlement from those who had previously been turned down when inquiring about film rights. This included David Shine, who once more wrote to Christie about his proposed film of Passenger to Frankfurt, only for her to be more forceful than ever, writing to, oh yes, Edmund Cork, her agent, that she, and now I'm quoting from Christie, will in no way consent. I am absolutely sick of these eternal requests from him. Again, I love a strongly worded Christie letter. And, I think if Catherine were here, she would agree that David Shine seems like quite a peach. And Christie probably dodged a bullet by not acceding to his requests to adapt Passenger to Frankfurt. This is not one of Christie's stronger novels, and it is also very much globe-trotting and would be extremely expensive to produce. So that is a pretty bad combination right there. So I can understand why Passenger to Frankfurt has not been adapted as of yet. I myself am not particularly pining after an adaptation for it. I still think that the one among those 4 Christies that has not been adapted, which really truly does need to be adapted, is Death Comes as the End. I say that as someone who likes Death Comes as the End much, much less than so many of you. I do realize that. But we do not have any adaptations to speak of, which is why we can move right along into the rankings for this novel. And I am so thrilled to now be able to bring in another voice, because I have been droning on now for so long. Let's bring Sophie on here and get right into it. I am so grateful to have Sophie Hannah with me here today to figure out where Passenger to Frankfurt fits in our rankings. There is obviously no way to replace Catherine, but there is a way to continue on with the project Catherine and I started. So I'm relying on friends like Sophie to do just that. And over the years, Sophie, you have been such a great friend to me and to Catherine and to our project. So it made sense that you would be our first guest to have on in this role. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really an honour and a pleasure to be back. Yeah, I just want to say before we start talking about the book, this podcast that you and Catherine created and nurtured and have kept going all this time is just one of the best podcasts out there, and certainly one of the big joys in my life. And I wish I could be talking to both of you about Passenger to Frankfurt, but I'm delighted to be the first guest. to tackle the rankings. I hope I do you and Catherine proud.
I know that you will. Yes, daunting task that that it may be. I really appreciate that. And of course, I wish that this were a three-way conversation as well. But let's jump right in. I'd like to start, as I always do, with a little bit of quoting from some critics. And I'm going to start with John Curran, who is not at all kind to Passenger to Frankfurt. He writes of the dismay with which the manuscript was greeted by both Christie's family and her publishers. He talks about the quality of the book despite its popularity, the book going, quote, straight into the bestseller lists and remaining there for over 6 months. So basically, John Curran's theory is that the success of the book was due to all the publicity surrounding it as Christie's 80th publication on her 80th birthday, and that its success had nothing to do with the substance of the book itself. And I should note that this is not a universally held opinion, and more on that in a moment. But Curran continues, Passenger to Frankfurt remains the most extraordinary book Christie ever wrote. Described wisely on the title page as an extravaganza, the description went some way towards mitigating the disappointment felt by both publishers and devotees, and showing little evidence of the ingenuity with which her name is still associated. This tale of international terrorism and engineered anarchy is difficult to write about honestly. Most fans, myself included, consider it an aberration and, but for the fact that it is an Agatha Christie, would never have read it the first time, let alone reread it over the 40 years since its first appearance. And I should note that John Curran is not alone in that opinion. This was Dorothy Olding's pronouncement. She, you may remember, was Christie's U.S. agent in the latter portion of Christie's career, and she was not afraid to voice her opinion in letters that she wrote to Christie's UK agent, Edmund Cork. This is what she said. Confidentially, I was bitterly disappointed in the book. It seemed to me a bad imitation of a spy story and a damned weak one at that. However, before I get your broad strokes view on this book, Sophie, which I'm very curious to hear, I just want to give the book its due and quote someone who actually quite liked the book. And that would be Laura Thompson, who's the recent Christie biographer we often reference on this podcast. And she writes that while the novel admittedly was backed by a lot of anniversary publicity, it also touched a nerve. With her unerring instinct, as Poirot says of Mrs. Oliver, Agatha now gravitated towards themes of global terror, the growth of evil, and the increase in violence for its own sake. Humanity had always been her subject matter. All her life, she had looked for the recognizable, the familiar within people who committed unusual acts. Now she perceived that the very things that made people recognizable to one another were being eroded and supplanted, were no longer even necessary. And then Laura Thompson actually quotes some really interesting extra textual comments that Agatha made when she was asked about Passenger to Frankfurt. And bear with me one second, because I think it is worth quoting, and then I will shut up, I promise. Young people are much more easily influenced than older people, Christie said, and evil can put on a better presentation of magnificence and importance than good can. Humility is and should be the first of the Christian virtues. I think nowadays that the worship of violence and of cruelty and the people who think that no aim can be achieved without it is a very evil influence, and it is successful in many countries and in many places. At the present moment, the things taking place in Ulster are the main expression of this. And I found that fascinating because that is a reference to the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which were totally raging around the time of this book's publication in 1970. And I think that's why that's fascinating, is that it actually does tether this supposed extravaganza to the very real and contemporary world in which Christie was living. So my initial question to you, Sophie, is where do you fall? Is Passenger to Frankfurt a disastrous and ridiculous extravaganza written by an aged person who's lost the thread? Or is it an incisive invective on the very real failures of humanity that Christie was observing around her late in her life?
If someone were to say this is not her most ingenious and well-plotted novel, I would probably agree with that. But nevertheless, I think I'm more in the positive camp than the negative camp, purely because there are so many either incisive or insightful or fun or witty or just purely enjoyable moments and sentences and phrases and observations. Like there's so much kind of goodies in there that even though, certain plot developments do make you kind of go, oh, okay, all right then. I guess that's where we're going. But they do feel, even those kind of flights of fancy on the plotting front do feel more like they're part of an extravaganza, right? Which is a kind of fun thing full of gusto and joy, an extravaganza. They feel more like they're part of that than like they're part of some disastrous failed novel. So, I mean, I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this novel. And, I wasn't expecting to. When you said that you wanted me to help rank one of the novels, I was like, oh, how exciting. And I was like, oh, it's Passenger to Frankfurt. That's a spy thriller, international espionage, which is something I just never, ever have, I've never finished a book that is of that genre. Like, I don't read spy thrillers. I don't read international political thrillers, mainly because I don't understand. By chapter 3, I'm usually thinking, hang on a minute, who's giving who this briefcase in an airport and why is all this happening? If it's not about interpersonal relationships, I very often get lost. So I wasn't the sort of ideal target audience. But when I started reading it, I was just intrigued. I was intrigued by the initial thing at the airport where Stafford Nye is asked to take this very big risk and trust someone he doesn't know for the sake of possibly saving her life, but he has no way of knowing whether he should believe that or not. That whole scenario in the airport really hooked me in. And then from then on, I was fascinated and gripped and wanted to know what happened next. So I feel about this book, actually, the way I felt about The Big Four, exactly the same. Like, I can see the weaknesses. It's not Agatha at her very, very best. It's not, And Then There Were None or Evil Under the Sun or one of the top-notch ones. However, I found it thoroughly enjoyable. Yeah. So if you're asking me to pick, am I in the yay or nay camp? I would have to say I'm in the yay camp. And I don't think, I didn't know it had been in the bestseller list for 6 months after it came out, but I don't think that is only because of the fact that it was the 80th book. I think it's also the fact that by then she had a following, she had fans. And as an Agatha fan, I can well imagine that lots of other Agatha fans started reading it and just thought, well, it might not be our ideal kind of Agatha Christie novel, but it's still really good fun. And the thing about Christie is that she, almost on every page, there's something very, very brilliant and worth reading, even in her weaker novels. So I don't know whether you remember, fairly early on in this novel, there's a bit where Aunt Matilda is talking about a church organist who's not very good and probably needs to be replaced. And then either she or Stafford Nye mentions that this organist's mother has been very ill recently. And Aunt Matilda says, and it's much more witty than this. This is a less good paraphrasing of it. But she says something like, well, having an ailing mother doesn't actually make you a better organist. We need to tell the truth about things. It's very important. And the way that is phrased, much, much better than I've just phrased it, it just made me laugh out loud. And there's so much of that. And then there's also the battle between good and evil, the sort of, something evil is going on. We, the good guys, have got to stop it. And I think that would have had massive appeal, as it does in any point in history, really. So, yeah, I'm a bit of a fan. And then, Kemper, we have to factor in the admittedly illegitimate aspect of me liking it, which is it's the only one of Agatha Christie's novels that I'm being part of ranking on the All About Agatha podcast. So it's like my one now. So I'm kind of sentimentally attached to it. So yeah, I actually loved it. And I can say that at the same time as admitting that, were there some ridiculous things in it? Were there some things that could have been done better? Yes, but I still loved it.
I love that you're invested in it solely because you're ranking it on the All About Agatha podcast. That's great.
I know, it's crazy. And I nearly didn't admit that, but I thought, what the hell, I'm going to admit it.
Listeners should know when I pitched this to Sophie that she was going to do the rankings for Passenger to Frankfurt, I tried to sweeten the deal because I figured that your reaction might be Passenger to Frankfurt. And I said, well, it'll be great to be able to talk about Agatha Christie without having to mention the name Poirot for once, since obviously you're constantly talking about Poirot. So, that was my attempt to just sort of make it go down a little easier. And I'm glad that you accepted the challenge. I agree with you to a certain extent. It's funny. I mean, I do know that had Catherine been a part of this conversation, she was very down on Passenger to Frankfurt, but she hadn't read it yet. And before I had reread it for the podcast, I felt very down on it as well. And I have a lot of critiques. I have a lot of criticisms and problems with this book, which we'll discuss. But I 100% agree with you that we always need to give Agatha Christie the benefit of the doubt. And while I almost always agree with John Curran, and I always respect his opinion, expert scholar that he is, I disagree with him as well. I don't think that we can just say that this book was successful because it was well promoted. Lots of Christie's were well promoted and some did better than others. And I think that this book did well partially on its own merits. And I kind of have to agree with you and Laura Thompson that I think it is capturing something of the moment in which it was written for a quote unquote extravaganza that's not firmly tethered to reality in the way that Christie's usually are. There's still a lot of contemporary references. You know, Stafford Nye, it makes 2 separate jokes about how hijackings are the modern fashion. And, you know, when I read those, I was just like, wow, yeah, this is really written in 1970. There were more hijackings then. Like you can tell that there was a fair amount of domestic terrorism that was happening. And again, that's why I found that extra textual reference to Ulster, which I hadn't even thought about, but I was like, oh, of course. Yeah. Of course, this was written in 2 years into the Troubles. I mean, that was half of what, you know, and Christie was reading the newspaper every day. And she talks in this introduction that she does to the book about how that informed her scene setting or creation really for this extravaganza. But even though it's not the quote unquote real world, it's one that's very much, I think, informed by the real world. And that feels relevant today because, my God, we're a world in turmoil right now as well on a massive scale, on sort of an overarching scale. So I wasn't reading it thinking, oh, this is just ridiculous nonsense, even though, yes, I mean, the plot is certainly not one of Christie's best.
I mean, it's not a mystery puzzle. So
no,
I think most Agatha fans and super fans, the books of hers they love most are the mystery puzzle ones, because in my opinion, that's like what she does absolute best. Yeah. But what I think is fascinating is I wonder whether there's a bit of a divide in super fan or fan reaction tendencies. So there's probably a kind of Agatha superfan, like maybe John Curran and maybe Catherine. And I think this came out in your and Catherine's discussion about the Big Four, actually, as well. I think she was less inclined to think favourably of it and you maybe enjoyed it a bit more. But anyway, my theory is the divide is there are some superfans, like possibly John Curran, possibly Catherine, who, when they read a Christie novel that isn't one of the best, they kind of think, I know how brilliant she can be, and therefore I know that this is not her best. So it does not please me, which makes perfect sense. Like, if you know the brilliance that Agatha Christie is capable of, you may well look at the Big Four or Passenger to Frankfurt and go, come on, could do better. But then I think there's another subgenre of superfan that loves Christie when she's at her best, obviously, but some of what makes us love her at her best still enables us to love her when she's not at her best. So, you know, when I read this book, I would say maybe you and I are more in this second category, because when I read this book, obviously I didn't think, what an ingenious plot, what clever placing of clues. You know, I didn't think of any of that, but I did still have some of my familiar, oh, isn't she brilliant moments with the sort of perceptiveness about human nature and the writing itself and just the sort of witty, clever touches that she has everywhere. So, yeah, I just sort of noticed all the things I did like. And because there were so many of them, when there was something that I thought didn't work, I was inclined to be less harsh, because I was just like, oh, but she's so brilliant. You know, I'll let her get away with this. I mean, for me, I'll tell you what I think the big flaw of this book, the big flaw rather than the Big Four. The big flaw of this book for me was too non-specific for too long. So at first, I thought it worked brilliantly when shadowy people whose identities we didn't quite know would pop up and say, there's something going on. It's going on in Italy. It's going on in Argentina. Nobody knows what it is, and I might not even be a person. You know, all this kind of cryptic, intriguing stuff. Up to a point, I was like, oh, the mystery is deepening. There's something going on. I can't wait to find out what it is. And then there came a point when I thought, no, this is now too much. non-specificness. The non-specificness has at this very moment become a problem. And that moment, I actually took a photo of the page on my Kindle so that I could read you out a bit. It's when Stafford Nye and the woman from the airport, who has about 75 different names.
We'll call her Renata, since that is her real name. Yeah.
So they go and meet Charlotte, who's the big, powerful boss, bad guy person.
Big Charlotte Crap.
And then Charlotte Crap, great name for a villain. And then shortly afterwards, they go and watch the young Siegfried addressing a big crowd in the arena, or whatever it's called. And we don't get to see that scene. So the chapter starts, and within 3 paragraphs, Stafford Nye is saying the young Siegfried gave his speech. Everyone raved about it and clapped and cheered, and everyone was totally, adored him, and they were falling at his feet. And yet, and this is the direct quote from the book, and yet what had the boy said? What had been the young Siegfried's message? There were no words that he could remember when it came to an end, but he knew that he had been moved, promised things, roused to enthusiasm, and now it was over. The crowd had surged. People were crying out. Now I'm not exactly quoting anymore. But so basically, the chapter begins with Stafford Nye going to listen to this amazingly, supposedly charismatic chap giving his speech. We don't get to see or hear anything he said. And then Stafford Nye tells us it was all over and everyone thought he was great. Now, I get why Agatha had to do that. She would have had to write the incredibly amazing speech and she would have had to come up with the specifics. But nevertheless, the absence of it at that point in the story just made me think, okay, this is all going to stay non-specific forever.
Yep.
And I just felt what it reminded me of. Now, you probably won't have seen this because it's a very English thing, but there's 2 comedians in the UK called David Mitchell and Robert Webb. Have you heard of them?
No.
They're 2 of my favourite British comedians. They had a sketch show called The Mitchell and Webb Look. And they did a sketch which was like a parody of a hospital drama like House or Grey's Anatomy.
This patient is incredibly poorly.
My God, I don't think I've ever seen anyone looking so peaky. Get me the medicine in here right now.
And the joke was that the people who'd made this particular hospital drama weren't medics, they were TV executives and scriptwriters, and so they couldn't really be bothered doing any medical research.
Yeah, it's a medical drama, but with the emphasis on drama rather than medicine. I think you get far too bogged down in so-called research.
Yeah, the producer arranged for us to follow a team of paramedics around for a month, but instinctively that felt wrong.
And they would talk with great urgency, but they would never specify what was actually wrong with the patient, and it was absolutely hilarious.
Am I going to be all right, Doctor? Yes, definitely. But we need to give you a spoonful of the right medicine, and maybe a tablet. I'm afraid this isn't going to taste very nice.
So I sort of felt that Passenger to Frankfurt was the equivalent in novel form of that sketch, because it's like there really isn't very much detail at any point about the sort of mechanics of this operation and what precisely is the message being put out by whom and what is it, when there are like shadowy global forces conspiring, yes, you can describe it in general terms, but there will be specifics. And I thought the main flaw of this novel is that it never really gives us those specifics. So that makes it just a little bit hard to believe.
I totally agree with you. It's even more damning than that, though, which is that it's unspecific and vague, but also it features the same sorts of vague generalizations that we've read from Christie over the decades at this point. And this is where, having reviewed the oeuvre in as compact a way as I think we have for the podcast, it really highlights, I think, how repetitive she gets sometimes as to the political thrillery stuff, because over and over again in this book, the specificity is basically that, well, young people are easily swayed, which is what she said in her extra textual comments, right? Young people are easily swayed and in their idealism could be made to think that they're going to pull down the status quo, create a new heaven and earth. That phrase, a new heaven and earth, is repeated about 5 times in the book. And in so doing, they're actually going to create something that is either unstable or just non-existent, which will be anarchy. And that's a terrible thing, and evil people are exploiting that naivete of the young people. We saw her talk about that as early as The Secret Adversary, her second novel, 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, which is a puzzle mystery, but also features many elements of an international political thriller, also is obsessed with the phrase, a new heaven and earth. This is something that comes up in They Came to Baghdad and also Destination Unknown. So we've heard her harp on this time and time again, and she's really not bringing anything new to the table, even though that is the main and almost sole preoccupation, I think, of this book. And you do at some point begin to feel the emptiness of that. It just doesn't play the way that it does in her better thrillers. And even though she's doing a lot of the same thing in some of those earlier thrillers, I think she pulls off the, who is this shadowy person? Who is Mr. Brown? Who is Mr. X? Who is the Marquis? In all those early thrillers, it's a little bit more fun. She has more fun. And I think she doesn't quite reach the same bar in this late thriller.
The lack of specifics is part of that. So yeah. I don't actually mind. I actually like it when writers have things that reoccur in different books they write, and you can see that that's one of their themes as a writer. Sure. So one of the things I love about this book, and I agree, it is slightly repetitive. She has done it often, but I actually love everything she says about how, you can only make a better world if you're kind and creative. If your attempt to bring about a better world involves hatred and violence and destruction, then your enterprise is doomed before it begins. Like, I am 100% with her on that. So I actually love the fact that sort of worldview and philosophy infuses the book. And I would take each book on its own merit. So I don't mind that the theme recurs in several books. So I remember it very well from 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. Mm-hmm. I agree with you that it was done better in that book than it is in this book. So I didn't mind meeting the theme again. But again, I think the issue is with the lack of specifics, because if she'd put in some really well-realized and vivid and engaging specifics, then no one would mind that there's this theme that she often has, because it would be like, oh, this is young Siegfried, and here's what he said, and here's how it all works, and this is what these people claim to believe in. Like, if there's all these young people all over the globe who are being massively won over by these impressive, charismatic blonde people, then the specifics really matter. What are they saying? What is their message of join us and things will be brilliant? Right. Like, we need the specifics in order for it to work novelistically.
Right. And the specifics should be as to character too. I mean, that's why, They Came to Baghdad, for example, there's a young man, a young, beautiful man who does embody the child of Lucifer. And he looks beautiful, but he's actually evil. And I remember his name is Edward. And I also remember there's that wonderful moment when Victoria, and I hate They Came to Baghdad, by the way, I can't believe I'm waxing eloquent about They Came to Baghdad, but there's this wonderful moment when Victoria, the heroine, she's been, listening to all of this airy, highfalutin nonsense about, what these people want to do. And then she's at a dig, right? Because she's in the Middle East, and she sees this unassuming, modest little earthen pot that has been uncovered. I think it was a pot, or it's some sort of, it's a clay bowl or something like that they've uncovered in the dig. And just the simplicity of it and the realness of it. And she realizes, that's real. That's important. That's kind of my tether, my connection to what I'm all about, not this nonsense. And that was powerful. I mean, that moment encapsulates, okay, that's what you're trying to say. I totally understand what you're trying to say. There's just a lot of bloviating, I think, about that point without, the specifics either as to conspiracy or character. And I think I bring up the previous examples, not because it's necessarily a bad thing when authors go back to the same, sort of themes or preoccupations. I agree with you. Sometimes that can be illuminating and interesting, but it's almost that she did it better before. And I think she's not quite in a lot of ways, she's not quite doing it as well here. And that's frustrating, but she was trying to do something a bit different.
Yeah. And it's worth pointing out as well that she was actually trying, because the edition I read had a kind of author's note at the beginning. Did you have? Yeah. So she basically says, listen, everyone, this is a fun flight of fancy. Just enjoy it. And as the young folks say these days, don't deep it too much. That's what my teachers say. Don't deep it. It just means like don't think about that too deeply. You know, she meant it to be a sort of fun adventure yarn. And I think it absolutely succeeds in being that. And, you know, yes, as we've said, the specifics of the plot are not quite there, but there's just so much that's great. Like that hook about, you know, being approached in an airport in that particular way, that is a great hook. So that's a sort of traditional Agatha staple. I think the way Stafford Nye's character is done is very skillfully done. You know, there's a moment where somebody says to him, you don't take people at their own estimation of themselves, but you also don't care what the world or authority thinks of them. You always form your own valuation and assessment of people. And, you know, the whole thing about him being seen as a bit of a maverick, so he's never quite progressed in the way that he should have done, but he doesn't care about that. People keep telling him his career's not going well. And there's a brilliant quote, and let me see if I can find my photograph of it, because it just made me laugh so much, where he's sort of denigrating about the very concept of a career. Somebody says, look here, old fellow, you don't want to go and ruin your career just by indulging your sense of humour. And Stafford Nye replies, I am quickly coming to the conclusion that there is nothing so boring as having a career. And just like stuff like that was what made me really enjoy it, basically.
Yeah, no, I agree. Stafford Nye is a fantastic character. I mean, I think that this is one of those books that's going to do well when it comes to the rankings for book-specific characters and to a certain extent setting and tone. And I agree with you on Stafford Nye. I have a couple of things about him I want to highlight when we get to it. But let's go in order, Sophie. Let's start, as we usually do when we're doing these rankings, with plot mechanics. And while I do agree with you that she is doing something different, and I love how she puts the reader on notice in that introduction, which is such an important part of this book, actually, and fascinating too, where she brings the reader through her process. It's great. This is interesting and not something that I think many readers of Christie will realize, but this plot in some ways is actually a bit of a retread and a recycling of a previous plot that Christie created 30 years earlier. And the short story that she wrote was The Capture of Cerberus, but it was the unpublished version of The Capture of Cerberus, which no one read until John Curran published it a few years ago in his Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, the first volume. And we covered that story a while back, but it was written, in 1939. It would have been published in 1940, but the Strand magazine rejected it because World War II was happening, and they deemed that it hit too close to home. And it actually was too on point about the war because the story features a character named Herzlein, who is an obvious stand-in for Hitler. And the story involves a switcheroo plot as to concealing and spiriting away this Hitler-like dictator. And it's totally identical to the switcheroo that's featured in this novel. But I think it's fascinating that she was actually recycling something that she had done much earlier and wasn't even able to publish. It sort of informs, I think, the overall preoccupation with Hitler and the Hitler Youth movement that we also get in this novel. I mean, Big Charlotte is a literal Nazi sympathizer. I mean, she talks about the gas chambers and the torture that happened in the concentration camps as being necessary. I mean, that's kind of shocking to read in a book written in 1970.
But obviously it's those words are put into the mouth of a deeply unsympathetic character.
Oh, of course.
I didn't know that she'd written something similar before. That's really interesting. I have been fascinated for a long time by Agatha's habit of taking something she's done before in one form, changing it and doing it in another form. Mm-hmm. I really find that so interesting. And I know you and Catherine talked about this on many occasions, but, Evil Under the Sun has echoes in other books, and Endless Night and Roger Ackroyd have certain similarities. And, that was obviously something she just quite freely and happily did. And I always ask myself, is that only okay because it's her? Because I don't mind it when she does it. If I read something like when I read Endless Night and it had certain similarities to Roger Ackroyd. That didn't bother me at all. I didn't think, oh, that's disappointing because she's done this idea already. But I wonder whether if other crime writers did that, would that be okay? Like, I've never allowed myself to recycle a sort of plot device or a plot point, but I have considered it, and I always end up concluding that just because Agatha did it doesn't mean I can do it. So I haven't done it yet, but I do find that fascinating. Another thing that I thought was it wasn't unpacked in the novel at all, but I kind of wish it could have been, because it was quite hilarious. You know, when Hitler comes to the place, the establishment run by that doctor, and there's all these other people in this establishment who believe they are Hitler. They have the delusion that they're Hitler. Potentially that's hilarious. Oh, yeah. Like actual Hitler going to a sort of institution full of people who think they're Hitler. Imagine if like someone like Mel Brooks did that as a satire. That would be hilarious. Like, how would the pretend Hitlers react to the real Hitler? How would the real Hitler react to the pretend ones? Like, when that started to emerge as a thing that was happening in the novel, I was like, please, let's see some scenes of all these Hitlers meeting each other and how they all react. But obviously, we didn't get those scenes. But I just thought that was a hilarious idea.
No, there's so many interesting sequences or events in the book, but almost all of them happen off page or aren't explored, I think, adequately or interestingly, which is unfortunate. I mean, what I would say beyond the confusing and meandering nature of the plot, which I don't think we need to really discuss further. I think anyone who's read the book would probably agree, like, yeah, this plot is not super tight and, you know, can get a little tedious. I think my big beef with the plot mechanics is that we really don't have a murder mystery here. And yes, we're not in a puzzle mystery. We're totally in a thriller, and a weirdo thriller at that. But Christie was almost always able to pull off the insertion of a murder mystery into her better, and I think for the most part, lighter thriller plots. For example, The Man in the Brown Suit, The Secret Adversary, Why Didn't They Ask Evans, The Seven Dials Mystery, even The Secret of Chimneys. Those are all thrillers. They're not really puzzle mysteries, but they do feature a robust murder mystery. And I really appreciate that in an Agatha Christie, because if I'm cracking open Agatha Christie, I really would vastly prefer for there to be a murder mystery. And I think what she's doing here is more along the lines of what she did in Destination Unknown and They Came to Baghdad, where there is a murder. Murders do happen, but they don't really preoccupy the story in the way that we're used to them doing in a Christie novel. And I think the murder in this one is the most tangential yet. Technically, we do have Millie Jean, aka Juanita J. She's unmasked as J at the end. You know, she does shoot her ambassador husband and make it look like it was the youth, the youthful protesters who did it. But my God, does that happen off page? I mean, it's barely even mentioned. Even the murder in At Bertram's Hotel, which, you know, that book also is a thriller, basically masquerading as a puzzle mystery. I mean, that murder like barely asserts its presence, but that's handled much better. So that kind of annoyed me. And then I also think that beyond the revealing of Jay as Millie Jean, which I really didn't care about because I barely saw Millie Jean because she's barely in the story. Also, the mole among them turns out to be James Cleek, who is by far the most boring person, I think, in that group. We also barely hear from him. He's essentially a secretary to Lord Altamount. We're told after the fact, after he's been revealed as the mole, that he's the son of Lord Altamount's best friend. We don't ever really get to know him. So that too was deflating and disappointing in a way that I don't think it always is in a Christie thriller. And the last thing I will say about plot mechanics is that I would have forgiven this book if Christie had more fun with the romance between Renata and Sir Stafford Nye, because again, this is going to be the same point that you were making, Sophie. We have a whole extended sequence in which Sir Stafford and Renata trot about the globe doing spy-y stuff, but we barely hear about it. It's very flat. And just imagine if this book were written in the 30s. In the spirit of Why Didn't They Ask Evans or The Seven Dials Mystery, that section would have been fun. It would have been flirty. There would have been hijinks. It would have been charming. Because we didn't get that, I completely didn't care that they ended up together at the end. I do not mind a romantic pairing at the end of a Christie. I actually cherish them, even if I'm rolling my eyes. But I wasn't even rolling my eyes when I got to the end. I just didn't care. I was like, okay, sure, they end up together. Fantastic. And there's that panda, right? Great. It's just, I don't know. It was a very unsatisfying satisfying ending for me.
I quite liked that. And I know what you mean. It is very different from the usual way in which two people get together romantically at the end of an Agatha Christie novel. This is very different from that. I quite liked the difference. I was expecting them to get together and hoping for them to get together. And I agree, we didn't really have much of a sense of their relationship at all, just that, they wandered about the world together saying cryptic things to each other.
And dressing up in fabulous clothes and, elaborate hairdos. Yeah.
But when it got to that very last bit and the way in which the communications that they sent to each other with the passenger to Frankfurt, I really liked that. And I decided that was actually a refreshing and different presentation of the romantic story in an Agatha Christie novel. So I actually like that. I agree with everything you've said about the murder mystery is incredibly tangential and James Cleek is not a particularly central and interesting character. But to be fair to this book in the plot mechanics category, I feel we can't really penalise it for not doing something. Because if Agatha's intention was to have the murder mystery aspect as a very minor tangential aspect, then she succeeded as that. So I take plot mechanics to mean for what the plot is trying to do, how successfully has it done it? So I would feel unfair taking points off on plot mechanics for Agatha's chosen prioritization or deprioritization of certain aspects of the plot. I totally get what you mean about it's less enjoyable because there isn't an ace murder mystery in it, but I'm not sure it's fair to say that that's poor plot mechanics. However, I think we'd probably end up giving a similar ranking for plot mechanics because I think we can take marks off in the plot mechanics category for the complete lack of specifics, because if there are no specifics, then there are no impressive mechanics. So if we don't know how exactly these people are trying to take over the world and what exactly is going on, right, then really what the plot mechanics are doing is kind of going, oh, just trust us that there are some. There are some plot mechanics. We're just not going to tell you what they are. So I wouldn't give it a particularly high score, but for that reason, rather than for the reason that it isn't a murder mystery, because it really isn't trying to be.
What would you give plot mechanics?
I would probably give it a 5. And the reason I would give it a 5 is that I think everything that you actually see happening, like all the people going about in the present doing their thing, is realistic. And yes, they could travel in that way. And yes, the airport scam could work in the way that it did. All of that's fine. So I would give 5 points for what's there in terms of plot mechanics, and I would deduct 5 points for what is missing, i.e. the things that should be specific that are just very vague and general. So I would go for a 5, I think.
Well, I agree that I think we can deduct for the lack of specificity. I, unlike you, am comfortable judging Christie for not. I just think that given that we know that she could have her cake and eat it too, so to speak, with the thriller plots, throwing in a murder mystery in previous books, I understand you're kind of respecting what might have been her decision to do something simpler and to focus on different aspects of the story. But I think that unfortunately, if that was her choice, I don't think she pulled it off as successfully as she wanted to. And I think that to a certain extent, this is the category to deduct for that reason as well. So I would deduct a little more. I would have given it a 3, but I'm comfortable doing a 4 if you want to split the difference and do a 4.
Yeah, I'm happy to do a 4. But I do just want to argue a little bit because, okay, let's say you were doing a podcast about the plot mechanics of Wuthering Heights, say. You wouldn't deduct points for the fact that there was no story about extraterrestrials invading Earth, because that's just not in the book. So I'm happy to go with a 4, but I don't quite get the logic of thinking that an element that just isn't foregrounded in the book is a failure of plot mechanics rather than, if it was a category called how much do we like this as an Agatha Christie novel, then I'd get it. But for me, plot mechanics surely has to mean the actual plot that Agatha has chosen to put in. How well does that work? Do you see what I mean?
I do, but I would push back on your analogy, which I don't think works, because you managed to pick an author who only wrote one novel. So you don't have any other novels to compare it to. And this is it's partially what you think we're doing when we're doing these rankings, because I think that it's not fair. You could absolutely make the argument it is not fair to judge this book on anything other than what happens between the first page and the last page. However, in reality, what we are doing, I think, when we're ranking, because we're ranking the oeuvre, right? We're ranking within context. I think it's absolutely fair to compare it to everything else she did, which isn't to say that she had to write the exact same type of book every time. And we need to pigeonhole her into, well, you have to put a mystery in and you have to do it this way. And I understand why you're pushing back on it, but I do think that we can judge this book in the context of the other books she wrote and reasonably say that this book is not as good when it comes to the plot mechanics, even if those choices were intentional, that she perhaps didn't choose as wisely in this case as she did in most other cases as to the mechanics of the plot. So I am judging outside of the book. It's true, but I think that's fair. And you can't do that with Emily Bronte.
Yeah, I think actually that is an argument that makes sense to me. So the fact that there are all these other Agatha Christie novels and they're all getting ranked in the same way, I think that does justify, you could sort of say, well, it's getting a lower mark for plot mechanics because there are amazing plot mechanics involving murder mysteries in most of the other novels, but not in this one. So that comparative thing, I think, is a reasonable justification.
And especially, which is why I wanted to make the point that I'm not even just comparing it to the pure puzzle mysteries, because that wouldn't be fair. But I'm comparing it to the thrillers, the successful thrillers that do manage to incorporate those elements that we love in an Agatha Christie, even though they are squarely thrillers and not puzzle mysteries. So that's I think is the fair comparison. And then I'm just going to continue then. So 4 for plot mechanics. And then on plot credibility, I'm going to do the same thing and compare it to some of, Christie's other works, because what I so love that Christie manages to do in her best novels, right? And Then There Were None is a perfect example of this, is that she makes what on its face, when you describe the book, sounds incredible and ridiculous. She makes it totally credible. And there's basically not a second when you read And Then There Were None where you don't believe that, yes, absolutely, these 10 people were brought to this island and one of them is psychotic and has planned this whole thing. And okay, now we know who it was. Yep, that makes sense. That checks out. And we're done. And it's like, it is totally credible, even though on its face, it's hard to believe when you actually sit back and think about it. That's one of the things I think she does time and time again. And I think probably she did it best in And Then There Were None. And I kind of think, unfortunately, she's doing the inverse here, because if I say to you, like, oh, this story is about how powerful people take advantage of the eagerness of youth to do terrible things. Like, on its face, there is nothing unlikely or improbable about that. And, as we've been talking about, and John Curran even talks about this, he says the idea of stage managed anarchy brought about by promoting student protest and civil unrest is not new in the Christie output. And he references Mr. Brown and the Secret Adversary, They Came to Baghdad, et cetera, all the books that we've been talking about. So she's done this before and she's done it more convincingly. And I think she takes a rather easy to swallow proposition and makes it hard to swallow because of the lack of specificity and the sort of harping on a new heaven and earth and putting in that weird 5-circle Venn diagram / Olympic symbol looking thing in the 2/3 of the way through the book. I didn't come away from this book believing that, oh yes, like this definitely could happen, but you might push back on that. I'm curious how you feel about that statement.
I think I agree 100% actually, because I have no trouble believing that, whoever's in charge in all the different countries all over the world could all get together and decide to, for example, force a drug on the entire population to keep them controllable. I have no problem believing that, but it's the lack of specifics that it's a bit like, going back to the Mitchell and Webb hospital sketch.
I'm going to use the electric shock that's a sort of medicine if you're very ill, but can make you sort of ill if you're fine. Clear. Oh no, he was fine. Now he's poorly from too much electric.
Like, if that were happening, if there was some kind of neo-Nazi conspiracy and everyone was indoctrinating and drugging the youth and all of that, surely the way it was talked about in the corridors of power would involve some specifics. Right. And for me, the fact that everyone was going, these people who are doing the thing, the big bad thing, we must stop the big bad thing, that was, it was again the lack of specifics that made it less than credible.
The young Siegfried, he's so beautiful and well proportioned, and he speaks well. We promise. He's brilliant. He's really brilliant. I actually agree with you, by the way, that I think this is such a typical Agatha Christie hook. I mean, even in her weakest novels, she hooks you. I mean, the hook is fabulous. The one thing that bothers me slightly is that, do we really find it believable that Sir Stafford Nye would take a drugged drink from a complete stranger? Like, I 100% believe that he would have given her his passport and sort of taken that risk. Is the drugged drink a step too far? Because that was a reaction that some people had as I was doing a little bit of secondary research on this. And I didn't necessarily have that thought when I was reading it, but perhaps there's a point there that it strains credulity a little bit.
See, I don't think that strains credulity at all, because Agatha has very carefully and skillfully created Stafford Nye as this character who, until he gets enlisted for various good causes by other people, he's content to just sort of amble around in an unserious way, sabotaging his career by making inopportune jokes. And he just doesn't seem to take life very seriously and is willing to that, because he holds everything lightly, he's going to be willing to take more risks. But also, the crucial point that whoever it is in the book makes about how he is a good judge of character. He sees through things. He doesn't care what the world thinks. He looks at people and situations and he sees the truth. I mean, maybe that as his talent is slightly hard to believe, but I was convinced that Sir Stafford Nye was someone who could just tell whether someone was going to secretly try and kill him or whether someone was basically a goodie just trying to get to their next airport. So I didn't have any trouble believing that he would drink that thing, whatever it was.
You know what? Listening to you, I 100% agree with you. I'm convinced by that. He believes himself to be a good judge of character, and he has that kind of reckless or fearless aspect to his personality, which we know Agatha loved. That's another running theme in her books, that she likes for people to be courageous and not driven by fear, and to take risks and to live life and enjoy life. And he's definitely one of those characters who we've seen before, and a quite well-drawn one, which we'll get to in a moment. The last thing I just want to say about plot credibility before we rank it is that we've talked in the past about how occasionally Christie does make up chemical substances or poisons rather than using ones that occur in real life, and how usually it's better when she's grounded and she's talking about, strychnine or what have you. So we had serenite in A Caribbean Mystery and calmo in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. But I think in this book, we have the worst fake substance that Christie ever created, which is Benvo.
I think the whole Benvo storyline is, again, a really interesting sort of moral dilemma exploration. She's posing the question. She was fascinated with moral dilemmas and sort of philosophical questions. This is one of the things that stands out to me in everything of hers that I read. She really is a philosopher of crime. Like she's crime fiction's philosopher, I think, because she's always asking moral questions. And the question she's asking here is, given that left to our own devices, we humans tend to believe pretty people who sound nice and then go off and kill each other in supposedly a good cause. And given that that's highly suboptimal, do we want to solve the problem by giving everyone this drug that just makes them lovely and non-violent, but that at the same time takes away everybody's moral agency? My guess would be that Agatha Christie would not favour that route and would instead favour a route where everyone kind of tries to be a better person and tries to learn that violence isn't the answer. So I don't think she's advocating the Benvo option. And I just found that Benvo detail another sort of highly implausible, obviously, but also just fascinating in the way that all the moral questions posed by the book are fascinating. As someone with, no scientific expertise whatsoever, maybe I'm being reductive by saying it's implausible. Maybe a scientist will be listening to this episode of the podcast and will go, actually, it would be possible to invent a drug that made everyone nice and non-violent. So I don't even know that it's incredible, but it kind of felt slightly incredible in the book. But I still liked it. I was like, wow, at the 11th hour, she's hitting us with another moral dilemma. You know, after all the sort of philosophical musings we've already had, suddenly we've got this, is it right to invent a drug that makes everyone nicer? You know, I sort of admired her gusto at that point, I think.
It's true. No, and it is a fascinating moral dilemma. And I agree with you. I think that she would come down squarely on the side of we should not drug the masses. But it is interesting that she leaves it as sort of an open proposition at the end of the book. That actually probably is a strength. You're right. Of the book, she's not answering the question. She's leaving it as sort of a fascinating open query. I know that I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it's one of my favorite aspects of A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's a play about the mayhem caused, right, by love potions and altering the emotional state of all of these various lovers that sort of like couple in different iterations. And there is a stable pattern between them that's achieved at the end of the play, but some of them are still under the influence of love potions at the end. And it's kind of this idea of like, well, is that okay? Maybe. It's interesting. It's just interesting because it's a happy ending, but it's not necessarily a natural ending. And,
exactly. And actually, since we're talking about the category of plot credibility, I guess we would I'm sure we're going to end up giving it not a particularly high ranking for plot credibility, but if we were, I know we're not, but if we were giving it a ranking for like its own stance on the issue of credibility, then I'd give it a 9 because it's actually a novel that is talking about and like drawing to our attention issues of credibility in fiction. And one of the things I think it does really well is it basically, and this is what I think Agatha's introduction at the very beginning, where she talks about the plausibility of the plot, I think this is what she's trying to do. What this story is deliberately a fairly implausible, really kind of quite over-the-top story that is not realistic in the usual sense, but that enables her to explore so many truths and important questions designed to get to the truth about human nature and the human psyche. So I think sometimes if people say, oh, well, that's unrealistic, that would never happen, they may be right or wrong about that. But if something that's unrealistic nevertheless leads you to reflect on what is true about the human condition, then that is just as valid an enterprise. So if I were ranking it for what it's saying about the whole concept of credibility and how important it is and why, I would give it much higher than I would give it for straightforward plot credibility.
I hear that. I agree with you. And I'm going to advocate for an extremely low score on plot credibility. I would give it a 2.
Oh, that's a little bit low, Kemper. I was going to suggest a 4 for credibility.
I could be dragged up to a 3. If you would do a 4 and I would do a 2, I can be dragged up to a 3.
That sounds like a reasonable compromise.
All right. So let's move along to series long characters. And you might think that we don't have any series long characters in this book. Oh, but we actually do. The fact that we might not recognize the series long characters, I think, is an encapsulation of the problem, because the series long characters that we have are very flat and boring. And they consist of 3 of the talking heads who Christie insists on revisiting from time to time in sort of high level crisis talks that they have with each other while they're wringing their hands about the disintegration of world order and whatnot. I found sometimes it was a little like being forced to eavesdrop on a boring business meeting or watching a ho-hum session of Congress on C-SPAN. For the American listeners out there, I feel like that last analogy doesn't work because politics is way too spirited and interesting these days. I don't think anyone thinks that politicians are boring right now. But anyway, first up is Mr. Robinson, who appeared in Cat Among the Pigeons and at Bertram's Hotel. He's also going to be in Postern of Fate, which, by the way, means that he single-handedly unites the Poirot-verse, the Marvel-verse, and the Beresford-verse. Unfortunately,
I didn't even notice that I'd met him twice before.
Exactly. I mean, his yellow face is still mentioned way too much. At one point, a minor character muses, foreigner he might be, Asiatic. That's about all that we get for Mr. Robinson. Then we have Colonel Pikeaway, who also appeared in Cat Among the Pigeons and who will also be in Postern of Fate. He's actually the best of these three. In Cat Among the Pigeons, he's described as always sleepy. And then Christie has a lot of fun describing him in this book. The physical description is quite good. I'm just going to read it out. Somebody had said that he looked like a cross between an ancient Buddha and a large blue frog, with perhaps, as some impudent youngster had added, just a touch of a bar sinister from a hippopotamus in his ancestry. And in this book, he sits in a small room with the windows closed, quote, completely covered in cigar ash. The atmosphere was almost unbearable, and the room was known in official circles as the small cat house. And what I learned from Janet Morgan, Christie biographer from the 80s, is that apparently the office that Max Mallowan and his good friend and Agatha Christie's good friend Stephen Glanville shared was exactly like this. So she was drawing from her husband, and Stephen Glanville's office apparently was just always full of smoke and people couldn't breathe in there. And there's a moment when Sir George Packham awkwardly has to suggest to Colonel Pikeaway that before they go off to a high-level meeting that he make use of a clothes brush to dust off all of that ash. And at that point, Pikeaway yells for Nanny, which immediately brings, quote, a middle-aged woman with a clothes brush appearing with the suddenness of a genie summoned by Aladdin's lamp, and she fixes him up. And that was funny. And Christie is so often funny, and she's not that funny that often in this book, which is why I wanted to highlight one little moment that I really appreciated. But the last person we have is Henry Horsam, who's another security guy, and I literally have nothing to say about him, but we will also see him again in Postern of Fate. All in all, I think this is a very dismal category. We will, have no fear, be ranking book-specific characters much higher. I would go extremely low on series-long characters.
I agree completely that those characters are all not particularly well portrayed. But is it fair to cast them in the role of series-long characters? So in other words, if there's a Poirot novel or a Marple novel where Poirot or Marple is hardly in it or not doing their usual ace stuff in it, that's clearly a problem, because a Poirot novel and a Marple novel really should have Poirot and Marple doing great things. Whereas those three series characters that you mentioned, they're more like minor characters who crop up now and then. So I'm not sure that them not sort of taking center stage and taking the world by storm is as negligent or as much of a problem, given that this novel is very much billed as a standalone, not a series character novel. So again, it's a bit like the plot mechanics thing. I'm not sure it's fair to call them even series-long characters, because there isn't a series featuring, say, Mr. Robinson. He's just a little background chap who appears every now and then. Do you see what I mean?
I do, but I'm not comparing them directly to Poirot or Marple. I'm comparing them to minor characters, to any minor character who appears in a Christie novel, almost all of which, I would argue 95% of which, are better drawn than these three characters. Because she often has her minor characters pop. And sometimes, I mean, that's why when we rank series long characters, we include Hastings, we include Ariadne Oliver, those two. I mean, they are such giants, right? Compared to minor characters like this. So that's also not even a fair comparison. But I think that she often does minor or even throwaway characters so much better than she's doing here. That's what I'm comparing it to. I take your point, and I'll be honest with you, when I was creating my little rankings summary before we got on this call, at first I was like, oh, well, I guess this is one of those times where we're going to have to just count the book specific characters category twice. But then I realized, oh no, wait, because I too forgot. And I was like, oh no, wait, we actually have, 1, 2, 3 characters who technically appear in other books. And I think, when she makes the decision to do that, to include a character in more than one book, she's raising the bar a little bit. And I don't think that she is, coming up to the bar that she's raised. This is one, again, where I would give it a 2. So if you are not comfortable with that, I guess I could begrudgingly forced to go a little bit higher, but I still do think that I think she deserves to be judged a bit harshly in this category.
I'm happy with a 2 if we're judging them as series characters. So I'll give in gracefully.
All right. Well, now, so we're going to come to a much happier category now, which is book specific characters. You already mentioned Sir Stafford Nye, and I totally agree with you that I think he's so well drawn. He's recognizable. I would recognize him if I came across him.
Really well done. And I think also Aunt Matilda is brilliant.
Oh my God. Well, this book, I have to say, this book for me comes alive in the scenes between Sir Stafford Nye and Aunt Matilda, because they are the two, I think, best drawn characters, and they have chemistry. Sir Stafford Nye and Renata do not have chemistry because they don't really do anything together. Aunt Matilda and Sir Stafford and I don't really do anything together either, but they have lively conversations about all sorts of fascinating things. And I adored both of them. And I think they were fantastic.
Yeah, I would go quite high in this category, I think. I mean, obviously, there's lots of book-specific characters who... It's because of the nature of the kind of story it is. There's, all the scenes where, Lazenby, the British Prime Minister, has all his people in his room. I mean, they're not particularly interesting or spectacular, but the characters who matter are done really well. Charlotte Crapp is a brilliant villain. The young Siegfried, I didn't have any sense that if I knew him or heard him speak, I would he was just a blank. I was like, well, I might like him, I might not. I probably wouldn't if he was saying Nazi-ish things, but who knows what he's even saying? If he was saying, I love cute puppies, then I might think, oh, he's lovely, So he was just a complete blank, and you just can't tell how you'd react to him. But if we're taking Stafford and I and Aunt Matilda and Charlotte as the main book-specific characters, then I would probably say 7 or 8.
I mean, I think we have to take them all. And I agree with you 100% that I think Sir Stafford Nye, and by the way, she makes this really great analogy between what Nye does and what the fool or clown pulls off in Shakespeare. And, we know that Christie loved her Shakespeare. And I just wanted to read that because I thought it was such a good point. She says, the king's jester who tells the king the truth and talks common sense and makes fun of all the things that are taking place in other people. Nye's job is to show how silly the scheme at the heart of the story is. And again, to Christie's credit, she 100% knows that it's silly. Like, she knows that this whole thing that they're trying to do is ridiculous and it's not going to ultimately succeed, even though this is a dystopian novel. And I love that she makes Sir Stafford Nye her very believable hero. And he goes a long way to, I think, this book working to the extent that it does. And then the other thing I just wanted to read out was her description of Big Charlotte, because it's just fabulous. Here is how she describes her from Sir Stafford's point of view when he meets her. She wallowed in her fat. A great, white, creased, slobbering mass of fat was her face, and set in it, rather like currants in a vast currant bun, were 2 small black eyes, very shrewd eyes, looking on the world, appraising it, appraising him. She's so rich and powerful, Sir Stafford's never even heard of her. And she's inherited a bunch of wealth, but then also capitalized on it in her own right. She's made her own fortune. I agree, she's a truly formidable adversary. So she's a high point. And the very Miss Marple-ish Aunt Matilda is a high point. Even the way Christie describes her as sort of pink-cheeked, and she kind of twitters on, but obviously possesses a very fierce intelligence. I just really, really enjoyed her, and a lot of her asides about, how she wasn't allowed to read novels in the morning. She goes on this whole tangent about how when she was a girl, you could only read novels in the afternoon, which reminded me of Jane Austen, talking about my family are great novel readers, which we now read as a boast, but that was actually a confession because it was kind of shameful that her family read novels. She talks specifically about The Prisoner of Zenda, by the way, which was one of Christie's favorite novels. And actually, she identified the hero of The Prisoner of Zenda as her favorite literary character when she was younger, in this little sort of questionnaire that her family would fill out, where they would ask intimate questions of each other and record them in a little family book. So she was very much drawing from herself, I think, in a lot of ways with Aunt Matilda. So they're fantastic. And I agree with the 7-ish for them. But I do think that not only the young Siegfried, but Millie Jean Courtman, who is our Jay, our masked villain, and James Cleek. I mean, these are supposed to be important people, and they are just non-entities. I would go for a 5. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I think that sounds fair.
Okay, so then let's...
I always just want to give, high marks, but yeah. Can I just, while we're on characters, I just want to say one more thing about Charlotte, which is, I don't know whether I'm just making this up, but there's definitely a bit where Charlotte says goodbye to Stafford, Nye, and Renata. And at the same time, the young Siegfried is there, and she says to Stafford and I something to the effect of, you two can go to your hotel now. Me and the young Siegfried are going to go to the boudoir. And then there's a definite reference to the young Siegfried leaving the boudoir at 11 the next morning. There is a definite implication that Charlotte and the young Siegfried are going to be alone together in a boudoir overnight. And it really stood out. And I thought to myself, is this Agatha's way of saying that as well, not content with trying to wreck the entire world and bring in an evil Nazi regime, is Charlotte kind of saying to the young Siegfried, I'll give you all this power and I'll make everyone adore you, but you have to be my lover. That's the price. I mean, that to me was what was clearly hinted by that bit.
I did not pick up on that, but I 100% believe it, because I think she makes such a point of describing Charlotte's greediness, her voracious appetite, right? That it's very easy to imagine that her sexual appetite is as massive as her digestive one. And I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and if she's chosen him, she thinks he's so gorgeous. She's in charge of everything. He's not in charge. I think Agatha was directing us there to the fact that she's also taken the opportunity to make him her sort of concubine.
There's a little bit of, let's be honest, it could honestly go in the stuck in his time category now that I think about it, but there's a little bit of nastiness as to the Charlotte character. I think there's a little undercurrent of fun being had at her expense due to the way she looks. The way she looks is very much informs her character, which strikes me as a little problematic and stuck in its time, given that we try not to do that, I think, now, to inform their character or glean their character from the way they look. And it feels like she's doing that a little bit here. I don't know if that's fair, but it just strikes me that she's doing that a little bit with Charlotte, but doing it effectively.
I was trying to work out. So I was developing a theory about the way she portrays Charlotte's appearance. And I'm not sure I've developed it fully enough, but I think she's trying to do something with, because the description, the constant descriptions of Charlotte's physical hideousness and grotesqueness are, it's just like every time Charlotte is mentioned, there is a reminder, there's either the word hideous or grotesque, or like we never are allowed to forget for even a second just quite how hideous and grotesque she is. And I think she's kind of saying, given that she's so powerful and she's basically the woman who can change the entire way in which the world is structured and bring in this new hate-filled regime, and she looks like this, and the way she looks is hideous, I almost wondered whether Agatha was trying to say, and this isn't in the book, this is me just wondering and probably just making it up, but I wondered whether she was trying to say that Charlotte had deliberately or must have deliberately chosen to look exactly the way she does, almost as a kind of power play. Now, I'd have to think more about that to work out what the details would be, but it didn't just feel like she's describing her in a very unflattering way. It felt like she was trying to say something about, like, look at who Charlotte is, look at what she looks like. Surely you don't think a woman as powerful as this would look like that unless she really wanted to. I guess that's what I mean. So that then led me off down all kinds of rabbit holes. Like, why would someone who was like Charlotte choose and set out to create this appearance, presumably that she knows will repel people? I don't know. I just think there might be hidden stuff going on there. Like Agatha might have had an intention there where Charlotte has constructed her own physical self for some strategic reason.
That's really interesting. I think there is something in that. She's, in a way, she's made herself as big as possible, right? As big and overpowering and physically imposing, even though there's a weakness in that. She can barely walk, right? She can barely get up and she can barely walk across the room, which is also mentioned. This is going to sound mean, but the character from another fictional world that came to mind consistently whenever she would describe Charlotte was Jabba the Hutt. The overflowing mounds of flesh and the way that Jabba the Hutt just kind of like spills into the scene and across the floor as that's Charlotte. It's that extreme. Anyway, it's definitely all done very well. We're going to rank that out of 5, which is good. Yeah. And then just going to go into setting and tone. The one thing I wanted to say specifically about this, because it was a little bit of a revelation, is that we, Catherine and I, interviewed Matthew Pritchard for the International Agatha Christie Festival 2 years ago in 2020 when it was all virtual. So we did an interview that's on YouTube, which we've referenced before. In that interview, he talked about how when he was 17 and 18, which would place this reminiscence in the early 60s, that he would go to music festivals in Salzburg and Bayreuth with his Nima. And he talked about how she would have to use an assumed name to try to avoid crowds of adoring fans. And I remembered that when I was reading the book, and I couldn't help feeling like Christie was drawing on that when Sir Stafford and I and Renata go to that musical festival in Bavaria, because it is one of the few parts of the globetrotting sequence that is well drawn. Yeah. And it felt like she was drawing on memories directly. And to my delight, here is what I learned from Christie biographer Janet Morgan. She had begun to think about the plot for Passenger to Frankfurt in 1963, asking Collins to find a copy of The Royal Family of Bayreuth by Friedelinde Wagner, the composer's granddaughter, whom she, Max, and Matthew had met at Bayreuth. Friedelinde had taken them behind the scenes of the opera house and later to King Ludwig of Bavaria's opera house and had told them anecdotes about her grandfather and Hitler. Agatha brooded on all this, fitting it to her ideas about world conspiracy and espionage. So I love that I could feel the specificity there because she was drawing on her experiences and that was what inspired her. I think that's really cool. And to a certain extent, I think that, she does okay on the setting because of moments like that. And we already mentioned that there are lots of contemporary references, many of them coming from Aunt Matilda in her ramblings. I mean, she touches on the conflict in Vietnam, computers, antibiotics, the current state of English domestic politics, where she can't even with labor. And she calls the liberals terribly wet. And she says the problem with the conservatives is that they don't have any fun. That's when she mentions The Prisoner of Zenda and all of that. So the only other thing I want to mention about contemporary references, because you mentioned the character of Cedric Lazenby, who's the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And as I was reading, I was like, well, that just reminds me of George Lazenby. I wonder when that Bond came out, because he was only in one Bond. I wonder if it was around that time. And then I looked it up, and George Lazenby was in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the one where he married Diana Rigg in 1969. So I feel like maybe it wasn't intentional. She just had the name on the brain, but I feel like he's inspired by George Lazenby.
Yeah, could well be. I mean, I also thought the airport bit was good for setting and tone, and the house that's very, very comfortable without being too ostentatious. That was well done. And the stuffy, smoky office. So yeah, I'd give it, probably a 7 for setting and tone.
I was going to give it a 6. I can be, I feel like I've been dragging you down a little bit. So again, I can be dragged up to a 7. I think a 7 is probably a little high because I do think for me, I mean, you had a great reading experience. I found this book to be a bit of a slog because I did find that the lack of specificity and the just kind of bewildering aspect of what is actually happening here got worse as I went along. And it was a terrific hook that fell apart. So for me, it was a little bit like Destination Unknown. It was a similar kind of reading experience. So I would definitely give it a 6. But, I do think that she really does make a lot of good points as to, the politics of everything. The only other thing I just want to mention, just to also further contemporize this, we talked about Ulster and the Troubles, but I think it's worth noting that what was also happening around this time was the formation of the European Economic Community. Like the European community. It's very much mentioned in there. At the time the book was written, England was not yet in the EEC, but they would be, it was very much in the news and in the ether. And the UK did enter it in 1973. And we actually do know that Agatha Christie voted yes on the referendum that took place 2 years later in June of 1975. It was just 7 months before she died that she voted yes as to whether the UK should continue to remain in the EEC. And we know that it was very much due to Max, because Max was very romantic as to politics, and she was very skeptical about the European community. And I think she would have been just as skeptical about the European Union. And she apparently said it would be no more than a customs union and a regulator's paradise. He was visualizing this unified historical and cultural and intellectual Eden. And she's just decided that, okay, I'll give it a shot for you. And she voted yes. And, that is the last time that there was a referendum on the UK's relationship with Europe until the referendum in 2016 that resulted in Brexit. And, people have wondered in the past, how would Agatha Christie have voted on Brexit? And I think that just shows that it's a complicated question and not one that we necessarily know the answer to either way. And I just think it's interesting because there's a lot of wondering about the European Union and whether or not that's an appropriate thing to join together, all these various countries. And she doesn't squarely come down on either side of it. It's another one of those interesting, not moral dilemmas, but moral situations that she presents in the book.
No, definitely. No, I think it deserves a 7. If you're happy with 7, let's that.
I'm happy with a 7. So we'll do a 7 for setting a tone. And then Stuck in Its Time, I'm just going to say, I think this book actually does pretty well for Stuck in Its Time. I will just briefly mention the areas that made me cringe a little bit, and there really are not many of them. There's a reference to Africa being behind the other continents when it comes to this world movement. And now I'm quoting, they're fairly new to power and graft and things, which is bizarre. And then there's an exchange that doesn't age well about a coordinated hijacking. Flew him to Milan, turned the passengers out, and flew them on somewhere else. Actually, Africa had pilots waiting there. Black men. Black power, said Colonel Monroe thoughtfully. Or red power, suggested Lazenby. And that's just kind of an unfortunately laughable exchange, I think, to our ears right now. And then in the same meeting as that above excerpt, we have this moment. The mild man with the Asiatic face who sat lower down at the table and had not yet spoken lifted up his face with the Mongolian smile. And then the last thing is that we have a reference to cretins that was a little hard to read. It was about the practice of giving them thyroid or taking it away from them. I forget which it is, to make them stop being cretins. Not that she's advocating for that. It was just a reference. And then there's a casual usage of the R word, that word being retarded late in the book, that may jar for a modern reader. But all in all, I don't think that this book jars in a Stuck in Its Time kind of a way. And I am totally comfortable with one single deduction.
I'm happy to defer to you on this. I kind of feel the Stuck in Its Time category is a different category of ranking from all the other rankings in a way. So I find it hard to think about that in the same register as I think about all the things that are just purely literary. So I would say you have far more expertise than I do in that particular area. Obviously, I know what you mean by Stuck in Its Time, but my view is that at any time in history, both now and in the 70s and in the 20s and whenever, there definitely were people who thought dodgy thoughts and had dodgy opinions. And there were definitely people who had really enlightened opinions at any point in history. So if I'm reading a book that's written many, many years ago and there's something in it that makes me go, ugh, I don't necessarily think, it's stuck in its time. I quite often read contemporary things that make me go, ugh. So that's, I guess that's just a point about the name of the category rather than anything else. But yeah, I mean, I'm really happy with your assessment of this particular aspect.
And I think you're right. It's very much about the reading experience. It's something that is part of the reader experience when one reads Christie that we felt we couldn't ignore. But you're absolutely right that it is not part of the literary analysis we do for the other categories. But I do think it's one that we cannot ignore. And I should really be consistent about calling it depictions stuck in their time. The issues themselves are not stuck in time. Obviously, they are timeless, actually. Yeah. But it is the depictions, the way that some things are portrayed sometimes that just jars and affects the read. That needs to be addressed. Yeah. So, all right. Well, we are at the end of our ranking and now at my favorite part of the episode, which is tallying up the rankings and seeing where we end up in our massive grid. So for Passenger to Frankfurt, we have a 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5 plus 7 minus 1 for a grand total of 20 points, putting Passenger to Frankfurt in a tie with 3 titles. So I'm curious where you think that this should go among these 3 titles, Sophie. We have The 7 Dials Mystery, Death Comes as the End, and Destination Unknown. Where would you put Passenger to Frankfurt among those 3?
It's definitely less good than Death Comes as the End. I, as you know, absolutely
that's right.
Death Comes as the End, and I think it should be way higher. So it's definitely less good than that. I think it's, what were the other 2? Destination Unknown.
Destination Unknown and The 7 Dials Mystery.
It's probably less good than those.
I agree.
So it's probably at the bottom of those 4, I would say.
I totally agree with that. So that actually puts Passenger to Frankfurt in 4th to last place. The only titles that are lower than it are Hickory Dickory Dock, The Big Four, and The Secret of Chimneys. And I know that you and I both actually have a lot of affection for The Big Four, as we discussed. So,
yeah. And I mean, it says a lot that I enjoyed Passenger to Frankfurt so much, and it's not my kind of book that I usually enjoy. And it's, so close to the bottom of the rankings. It just shows how brilliant a writer Agatha Christie is. If her, 5th or 4th worst book is so entertaining, she's obviously a great genius, which we already knew.
She's a genius. And that reminds me, just when you were making that point about how you love Christie so much that you love her lesser works, that's the kind of person you are, as opposed to someone who loves her so much that they get disappointed when she's less than perfect. I am exactly the same type of person. I actually always make the analogy to sushi, which is that I love sushi. I absolutely love sushi. And because I love sushi so much, I often eat subpar sushi. I will eat any sushi anywhere, out of the supermarket, whatever. It doesn't matter. And I remember explaining this to someone and they were like, that makes no sense. If you love sushi, you should want the best sushi. And I said, no. I love sushi. So I'm perfectly happy eating pretty bad sushi. So there you go.
It's a crucial distinction. Which kind of fan are you? The one that insists on the best quality or the one that loves it all?
Yep. I'm glad that we both love it all. I feel seen by you, Sophie. Well, this could not have gone better. Honestly, I mean, I think that was such a great conversation and I'm happy with where it ended up in the rankings. And I so agree with you that, we had such a fascinating conversation about it and yet just put it fourth to last. And that just speaks to the power of Christie overall. So thank you so much for doing this and having this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me on it. It's been like amazingly good fun.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, I just want to thank Sophie Hannah again for coming on. I think our conversation was so thought-provoking and enjoyable, for me at least, and I hope that you felt the same way. She did such a great job. I knew that she would just slip right into her co-host role with ease and alacrity. So for our next episode, I am going to be covering the Poirot short story Double Sin, which also has an early Suchet adaptation. So very much looking forward to reading that and watching that episode. I'm going to make this wrap up brief because this ended up being a super size episode. I would, of course, love to hear from you. And I should once again say how much I appreciate hearing from so many of you at the end of last year during the immediate aftermath of Catherine passing away. I so appreciate that. Of course, that mourning and grieving process is still going on. And if you would like to reach out to me about that or anything else, I would love to hear from you. First off, you can get bonus content from me and Catherine in the archives and moving forward from me on our Patreon site, which is over at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. In the most recent episode, I actually discussed a thriller that falls into the subgenre of mum noir, involving the harried mother of a baby who has older children. And I very much related and had a lot of fun talking about that thriller, The Hours Before Dawn by Celia Fremlin. Very interesting and very funny book. You can, of course, email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame. We are also on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And if you haven't yet done so, I really would appreciate it if you could take a moment to give the podcast a rating and or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you may happen to be listening to it. And I'll see you next time. Bye.